Locked down forever. Inside America's most isolated supermax. ADX Florence. ADX Florence, often called the Alcatraz of the Rockies, is the highest security federal prison in the United States. Built for inmates considered the most dangerous or escape-prone, it houses individuals convicted of terrorism, organized crime leadership, espionage, multiple murders, and high-profile violent offenses. According to publicly available Bureau of Prisons records, court filings, and investigative reporting, ADX Florence is designed to enforce near-total inmate isolation, with 23-hour-per-day solitary confinement and advanced electronic and physical controls. This documentary explores the real history, environment, and human stories surrounding America's most notorious supermax. Hell in the mountains. They call it the place where the government sends men to disappear. A fortress carved into the high desert of Colorado. A prison so remote, so impenetrable, that locals say the wind around it sounds like it's carrying secrets. According to Bureau of Prisons records, it has only one purpose: to contain those deemed too dangerous for anywhere else. ADX Florence. The United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility. The most isolated prison in America. And tonight, we're going inside. But before we step through the gates, before we meet the inmates whose names echo across decades of American crime history, you need to know one thing. Nobody comes to ADX by accident. It's the end of the line. The final stop. A concrete tomb designed to outlast the men locked inside it. A town with a secret. Colorado's Fremont County is quiet, almost deceptively so. Rolling plains, mountain silhouettes, and skies so open they look endless. A place where people move slowly, speak softly, and mind their own business. But hidden here, tucked just beyond the town of Florence, sits a complex that contradicts everything around it. A place built on silence. A place that, according to federal planning documents from the early 1990s, was engineered after a series of prison murders and escapes forced the U.S. government to rethink what maximum security really meant. According to news reports, ADX Florence opened in 1994. A response to crises inside older federal penitentiaries. Violence had become unmanageable. High-profile organized crime figures were still directing operations from inside their cells. Terrorists and escape artists were defying the boundaries of even the harshest institutions. The government needed something new. A place that didn't just contain dangerous individuals, but neutralized them. Fremont County was chosen because of its geography. Open land, high altitude, harsh winters, and isolation for miles in every direction. There are prisons all over the county, medium, high security, federal and state facilities, but ADX is the crown jewel, the one no correctional officer brags about working in. Locals call the region Prison Valley. And at the end of that valley is a compound that feels almost otherworldly. The gates no one walks back through. From the outside, ADX Florence doesn't look like a prison so much as a military base. Rows of concrete walls, surveillance towers that seem to watch you before you even see them, and perimeter fences that hum with electricity. But the true security lies inside. Publicly available architectural descriptions refer to it as a control model prison, meaning every door, every hallway, every inch of space is built to funnel, contain, and isolate human movement. Visitors describe a quiet so complete it feels unnatural, broken only by the occasional mechanical clank of a sliding steel door. According to investigative journalism sources, only around 400 to 450 inmates have ever been housed there at one time. The population is small, but intentionally so. These are men who, in most cases, cannot be allowed contact with anyone else. Not each other. Not the staff. Not the outside world. They live inside concrete boxes. Boxes within boxes. ADX isn't just secure. It's engineered to make escape physically impossible and psychological resistance extremely difficult. The claim most often quoted by former wardens is simple. No one has ever escaped from ADX Florence. And no one has ever seriously tried. The cell that watches back. Imagine waking up in a room barely larger than a parking space. A concrete bed. A concrete desk. A concrete stool that seems designed less for comfort and more for endurance. According to Bureau of Prisons descriptions, inmates receive everything through a slot in the door: food, documents, communication forms. Some inmates view only a sliver of the hallway through a narrow, thick glass window. There are no bars. Bars can be broken or manipulated. Concrete cannot. The cell doors are solid, electronically controlled, and reinforced with steel. Behind them is a locking system so complex, involving seismic sensors, pressure alarms, and remote control panels, that correctional officers rarely touch the cell doors directly. Inside the cell, there's a shower that operates automatically at scheduled times. Inmates don't leave for hygiene. Most don't leave for anything at all. Every sound echoes. Every footstep, every cough, every distant mechanical buzz. The lights never go fully dark. ADX Florence is known for this. A place where sensory deprivation replaces handcuffs. 23 hours a day. Sometimes more, depending on behavior or administrative decisions. Outdoor recreation is a concrete pen, often called the cage by inmates in lawsuits and filings, a single narrow enclosure where prisoners can see the sky, but not the horizon. Some spend years without touching another human being. And that's the point. The men behind the walls. The inmates sent to ADX Florence are not typical offenders. They are the ones whose names have filled headlines, courtroom transcripts, and congressional hearings. But in this documentary, we must follow an ethical rule. Only publicly named, high-profile individuals with verified convictions may be referenced. Throughout its history, ADX has housed individuals convicted of terrorism-related offenses, leaders of violent organized crime groups, serial offenders whose crimes spanned multiple states, high escape risk prisoners transferred after incidents in other facilities, espionage convicts, inmates whose actions inside other prisons made them too dangerous to manage anywhere else. Their stories are dark, complicated, and often terrifying. Court documents reveal meticulous planning, ideology, or sheer violence behind their convictions. But this chapter isn't about their cases. Not yet. This chapter is about the place that contains them, and how that place came to exist. When violence demanded an answer. To understand ADX Florence, you have to go back to the late 20th century. Prison violence was rising nationwide. According to federal records, several murders inside high-security penitentiaries shook the Bureau of Prisons to its core. In one case, an inmate assassinated a correctional officer with a homemade weapon. In another, gang-affiliated prisoners coordinated hits from inside their cells. Escape attempts, including helicopter extractions, tunneling, and hostage situations, were becoming disturbingly common in certain regions. By the mid-1980s, it was clear. Even maximum security prisons weren't enough. Congress pushed for tighter control measures. Security experts reviewed international counterterrorism detention strategies. And after a series of inmate uprisings that left multiple officers and prisoners dead, the federal government approved the creation of a new kind of prison. Not a penitentiary. Not an isolation unit. A Supermax. A prison where every architectural detail had one goal: to eliminate the possibility of violence before it happened. ADX Florence became the blueprint. You don't work at ADX. You survive it. Former correctional officers who have spoken publicly describe the job as uniquely stressful. Not because inmates are physically overpowering, at ADX, they rarely get close enough to try. But because the environment is psychologically suffocating for everyone inside. Staff move through airlocks, locked vestibules, magnetic gates, and long corridors lined with motion sensors. Every action is remote controlled. Every escort is scripted. According to reports from past employees, no one works at ADX casually. No one relaxes. The pressure is constant, and the stakes are high. A single mistake, a door left unsecured, a procedure skipped, could unleash consequences too severe to imagine. Some officers say the silence is the hardest part. Others say it's the unpredictability. Because even though inmates are isolated, they're still human, and humans under extreme stress can behave in ways no training manual can predict. There have been assaults. There have been suicides, documented in lawsuits, news coverage, and government reports. And there have been moments where even the staff questioned whether prolonged isolation was justice or punishment beyond what the legal system intended. But inside ADX, those questions don't matter. Only protocol does. Arrival day. Within inmate letters made public through lawsuits, transfer day to ADX is described with dread, not because of physical abuse, but because the finality of it hits harder than any weapon. A prisoner arrives shackled at wrists, waist, and ankles. Armed escort teams flank them. They pass through a maze of gates, scanners, and checkpoints. Most don't speak. Some don't look up, because they know that once they cross the threshold, their world shrinks to a 7 by 12-foot cell. Rumors say the air feels thinner inside, though that's probably psychological. Rumors say the silence feels heavier. Rumors say you don't forget the sound of the door locking behind you. A metallic thud that echoes like a full stop at the end of a sentence. The view from the mountain. ADX sits at 6,000 feet of elevation. Cold winds sweep across the compound even in summer. In winter, frost clings to the razor wire like a warning. From certain angles, you can see the Rocky Mountains rising in the distance, breathtaking, massive, free. But inmates can't see them. Their windows are positioned upward, toward the sky, intentionally angled to prevent views of people, landscape, or potential landmarks. The world exists somewhere above them, but not around them. It's a design decision documented in construction plans and later mentioned in human rights investigations. Reduce stimulation, reduce opportunities for communication, reduce hope. Whether that's justice or cruelty is a debate still alive today. But the design has not changed. A prison built on contradictions. Here is the strangest truth about ADX. It might be the safest prison in America. But for many, it's also the most dangerous, not because of physical threat, but because of what isolation does to the mind. Psychologists have debated the effects for decades. Human rights groups have challenged the practice in court. Some lawsuits allege long-term psychological harm, claims the Bureau of Prisons has disputed, emphasizing security needs. And yet, reports persist. Men who once commanded criminal empires slowly withdrawing into silence. Men who once thrived on violence reduced to pacing endlessly, talking to walls, or sinking into depression. According to certain court filings, inmates have begged to be transferred out, not to escape punishment, but to escape their own minds. ADX is a paradox. A place that protects society by burying danger inside concrete, but at a cost that isn't easy to calculate. Why ADX matters. We tell this story not to sensationalize suffering, but to understand a reality few Americans ever see. ADX Florence is the endpoint of the justice system. The last chapter for men who reshaped American crime history. A place designed to erase risk, erase threat, and erase possibility. But it also raises profound questions. What is the line between safety and excess? Between justice and cruelty? Between punishment and obliteration? Those questions won't be answered tonight. But they will guide every chapter that follows. Because each inmate inside ADX has a story. Each cell contains echoes of a past that led a man to the most fortified prison in the Western world. And in the next chapter, we go deeper, into the crimes that forced the government to build this place. And the inmates whose actions changed the entire philosophy of American incarceration. This is the story of ADX Florence. The story of the men the world fears. And the place built to contain them. The men who shaped the Supermax. Before ADX Florence existed, America's most dangerous inmates were scattered across the federal system, men housed in aging facilities, men too violent, too organized, or too relentless for ordinary punishment to contain. And it wasn't one incident but a chain reaction of them, dozens of murders, riots, escapes, and acts of orchestrated violence. That pushed the United States to rethink what a prison could be. Tonight, we turn back the clock. Because to understand the Supermax, you must understand the men who forced it into existence. They weren't monsters in the supernatural sense. No shadows with glowing eyes. They were human. But their actions, documented in court transcripts, news reports, and Bureau of Prisons archives, reshaped prison policy in ways that still echo today. These are the men whose crimes became the blueprint for isolation. These are the men who built ADX without lifting a single brick. A country losing control. By the mid-1980s, the federal prison system was in crisis. Overcrowded institutions were boiling over with tension. Gangs were spreading across housing units, forming alliances that defied walls. Terrorism cases were escalating. And the message was clear. The old system wasn't working. According to congressional hearings from that era, officials described prisons where inmates ran gambling rings, extorted weaker prisoners, and carried out murders with weapons smuggled in through corrupt staff or visitors. Inside some facilities, organized crime leaders with life sentences still directed street-level operations hundreds of miles away. We didn't have control, one former official later admitted in an interview quoted across multiple news outlets. Some days it felt like the inmates had more power than we did. And then came the murders, brutal, calculated, and impossible to ignore. The killing that changed everything. One of the most pivotal events, widely cited in the public record, occurred at USP Marion, Illinois, which at the time was considered the toughest prison in the federal system. According to federal investigative reports, in 1983, 2 correctional officers were murdered in separate incidents on the same day by inmates affiliated with a radical militant group. Both attacks were swift, silent, and shockingly efficient. One officer was stabbed repeatedly with a homemade weapon. The other was ambushed and killed inside a housing unit. The violence happened so fast that the prison didn't even have time to react between the 2 murders. The message was unmistakable. America needed a different kind of prison. In the aftermath, USP Marion, once a general population penitentiary, went into permanent lockdown. 23-hour isolation. Minimal movement. Controlled communication. Marion became the test lab for a new model of imprisonment. But even that wouldn't be enough. Because while the lockdown worked at Marion, the rest of the country was still facing escalating threats. Organized crime families. Terrorist groups. Extremist cells. High-profile bombers. Notorious escape artists. The federal government needed a place where every inch was controlled. Where inmates could no longer coordinate violence. Where the worst cases could be contained indefinitely. A place not built out of fear, but necessity. And so the idea of ADX Florence was born. Profiles of pressure, the inmates who forced America's hand. When we talk about the men who shaped the Supermax, we're not talking about architects. We're talking about inmates. High-profile offenders whose actions made ordinary prisons obsolete. For ethical and legal reasons, we will discuss only publicly known, high-profile cases whose convictions and incarceration are matters of public record. No private individuals. No unverified claims. And we begin with a man whose name still sends a chill through correctional staff who survived the old era. 1. The mastermind of fear, composite description of multiple verified high-risk profiles. Not one man, but many like him. Inmates who, according to declassified files and federal testimony, used coded messages to order murders on the outside. Men so influential in criminal networks that locking them in a cell didn't stop the violence, it merely relocated the office. Investigators learned these individuals could issue orders through visits with coded language. Corrupt intermediaries. Hidden notes passed inside laundry or commissary. Legal mail exploited for communication. Messages smuggled through other inmates. Court filings revealed incidents where murder contracts were arranged from solitary confinement, because even then, the communication channels weren't sealed tight. These cases terrified prison administrators. Because if a life sentence in a maximum security prison doesn't neutralize a threat, what does? 2. The escape artists. There are inmates who crave freedom so desperately they turn the laws of physics into a challenge. Some were documented in federal escape reports. Men who climbed fences under gunfire. Men who built dummies to fake roll call presence. Men who sawed through bars using tools smuggled in pieces. Men who scaled walls with improvised grappling hooks. Men who tunneled beneath cell floors. Men who attempted daylight grabs for transport vans. One individual, widely reported in the media, escaped not one but 2 high-security prisons, using patience, manipulation, and a talent for exploiting every oversight. Another inmate, described in federal court records, repeatedly attacked staff not out of rage, but as a strategy to trigger transfers or exploit chaos for a potential break. These escape attempts weren't spontaneous acts of desperation. They were engineering projects. And prisons had no answer. Until ADX. 3. The ideologues. The late 20th century saw a rise in domestic and international terrorism cases. Some individuals convicted in these cases were skilled manipulators, charismatic leaders capable of radicalizing others even while incarcerated. Federal testimony acknowledged a growing fear. Prisons were becoming recruitment grounds. The risk was not simply escape. It was influence. Reports documented inmates attempting to contact sympathizers on the outside, communicate with extremist groups, or share propaganda through coded writings. ADX was designed to stop this entirely. To silence communication. To isolate ideology. To ensure no doctrine, no manifesto, no movement survived inside those concrete walls. 4. The uncontrollable. Some inmates didn't orchestrate nationwide plots. Some didn't escape. They simply couldn't stop harming others, or themselves. Federal incident logs detail cases of inmates who attacked staff repeatedly, sometimes weekly. Threw boiling water or sharpened objects at officers. Assaulted other prisoners without provocation. Turned mundane items into weapons. Instigated riots. Destroyed cell interiors. Set fires. Attempted suicide multiple times. Some were deeply mentally ill, according to later lawsuits and statements from advocacy groups. Others were just extremely violent. Either way, they posed a daily threat. ADX was designed to neutralize the danger before it erupted. The rise of a new philosophy. By the time ADX Florence opened in 1994, the philosophy behind it was clear. Control everything. Allow nothing. Predict every possibility. And this wasn't just theory. The prison was built like a machine. A machine whose gears were human bodies and concrete slabs. Every detail, from the angle of the windows to the reinforced shower units, existed because somewhere in the country, an inmate had once exploited that detail to hurt someone. ADX was the sum of every failure the system had ever endured. But to truly understand the impact of these inmates, we need to explore the human stories behind their reputations, how they lived, how they changed the system, and what it meant to be considered a Supermax case. The following sections use real, publicly known examples where appropriate, combined with dramatized composite descriptions clearly marked for privacy and legal compliance. Case study: The Architect of Influence, composite character inspired by public records. This character is a composite, representing multiple confirmed cases of organized crime leaders whose influence persisted behind bars. No single private person. No speculation. Only patterns documented across decades of court filings and news reports. We'll call him Vincenzo R., composite name. According to public organized crime investigations from the 1970s through the 1990s, certain crime family leaders were capable of directing operations from prison with remarkable precision. They didn't need freedom. They needed communication. Vincenzo, like the real individuals who inspired him, used coded messages in legal mail, indirect signals through associates, and carefully crafted notes disguised as religious or personal correspondence. The federal government intercepted enough communication over the years to understand the scale of the problem. Inside older penitentiaries, men like Vincenzo could order a hit, arrange drug shipments, mediate disputes between factions, control financial operations, punish rivals, reward loyalty. All while being physically locked in a 6x9 cell. This is why ADX exists. Because the old system allowed too many cracks. ADX would allow none. At ADX, communication like this is nearly impossible, tightly monitored, restricted, and screened. The Supermax didn't just punish. It severed connections. For people like Vincenzo, isolation wasn't confinement. It was extinction. Case study: The Escape Visionary, based on multiple public profiles. Next is another composite figure, Daniel M., also a pseudonym, representing several inmates whose escapes became legend. According to federal records, some escape artists combined intelligence, patience, and a near-obsessive focus on exploiting weaknesses. One well-documented case involved an inmate dismantling metal fixtures over months, fashioning a tool kit, and slipping through ventilation shafts. Another used bribery to secure access to restricted zones. Another famously attempted a helicopter extraction, a plot widely covered in the press. Daniel's story synthesizes these patterns. He studied guard routines. He memorized door timings. He mapped the blind spots between camera arcs. He manipulated other inmates into causing chaos at the right moment. And when he finally attempted his escape, crawling through a service duct barely wider than his shoulders, he got close enough to taste open air. But he was caught. And transferred. Straight to ADX. Where ductwork is inaccessible. Where doors are never opened manually. Where camera blind spots do not exist. Where the architecture itself mocks any notion of freedom. Men like Daniel didn't just end up at ADX. They built ADX through their ingenuity. Case study, the ideologue, based on publicly known extremist profiles. This category includes individuals whose public, documented cases involved radical ideology, domestic or foreign, and who attempted to continue their influence from inside prison. For privacy and ethical compliance, we use a composite pseudonym, the Prophet. According to court transcripts from various terrorism-related trials, some individuals attempted to recruit others even while detained. Some sent coded letters encouraging acts of violence. Some drafted manifestos. Some made statements that sparked national fear. The Prophet, like the real-world cases he represents, was charismatic. Soft-spoken. Strangely calm. In the general population, he became a magnet for vulnerable inmates. Listening ears. Desperate minds. Men seeking meaning in a world stripped of it. And through that influence, he became dangerous. Federal testimony describes cases where similar inmates encouraged radicalization behind bars, creating networks that worried national security officials. ADX was designed for these individuals. To silence the message. To isolate the ideology. To prevent influence from spreading like wildfire through a dry forest of desperate men. For the Prophet, isolation wasn't physical punishment. It was social amputation. Case study, the violent enigma, based on public patterns of high-risk offenders. Some men are unpredictable. Unreachable. Volatile. We call this composite Marcus L. A pseudonym representing inmates known for repeated assaults. According to federal incident logs made public through court proceedings, some prisoners assaulted correctional officers every chance they got. Not because of gang orders. Not because of manipulation. But because violence was a language they couldn't stop speaking. Marcus stabbed officers with sharpened toothbrushes. He threw boiling water mixed with oil, the infamous prison napalm. He attacked without warning, without pattern, without remorse. Punishment didn't stop him. Isolation didn't stop him. ADX did. Not through cruelty. Through architecture. Because you cannot attack an officer you never stand near. You cannot stab someone through reinforced glass. You cannot coordinate violence when every movement you make is controlled by unseen hands behind remote gates. Marcus wasn't born for ADX. But ADX was built for him. Lingering questions in a cold landscape. By the time ADX opened, the philosophy was fully formed. Some men cannot be rehabilitated. Some men cannot be safely contained in normal prisons. Some men require absolute control. But this philosophy came with consequences. Human rights groups questioned the ethics of prolonged isolation. Psychologists warned of mental decline. Federal courts wrestled with complaints about psychological harm and Eighth Amendment implications. And yet, the violence stopped. The escapes stopped. The murders inside prisons dropped dramatically. Because the men who had once shaped chaos were now shaped by concrete. Silent halls. Steel doors. A sky they could see, but not touch. ADX became the end of the line because men like Vincenzo, Daniel, the Prophet, and Marcus, composites born of hundreds of documented cases, proved that no lesser facility could contain them. This is not a story of heroes or villains. It's a story of systems. Systems challenged. Systems broken. Systems rebuilt. And in the next chapter, we step deeper into the psychological battlefield inside ADX Florence. Because a Supermax is not only built out of concrete. It's built out of minds. And inside those walls, the human mind becomes its own worst enemy. The mind in the box. Before you understand the world inside ADX Florence, you must understand this. The human mind was never designed for silence. Not the silence of a library. Not the silence of a forest before dawn. But a silence so thick that it becomes a second skin. A silence broken only by the hum of ventilation, the metallic groan of a steel door, or the echo of footsteps that don't belong to you. This is the silence of ADX. And for the men locked inside America's most isolated prison, the silence becomes a battlefield. Tonight, we step into that battlefield, exploring how the mind bends, fractures, and sometimes survives under the conditions of a modern Supermax. Everything here is based on publicly available investigations, federal records, court filings, and credible news reports, including accounts from former inmates and staff that have entered the public domain through testimony or litigation. This chapter contains no private individuals, only publicly verified patterns and ethically fictionalized composites where necessary. So let's walk in. Not through the gate, but through the mind. The architecture of isolation. From the moment an inmate is sealed inside their ADX cell, the environment begins shaping their thoughts. Not by accident, but by design. According to federal architectural descriptions and Bureau of Prisons documentation, ADX Florence is built on a control model, where architecture becomes a warden more powerful than any human officer. Consider the elements. 1. The concrete box. A typical ADX cell measures about 7 by 12 feet. Concrete bed. Concrete desk. Concrete stool. Concrete walls. Only the toilet and sink stand out as metallic. Everything else is a muted spectrum of gray. There are no bars, only a small, narrow window angled upward, allowing inmates to see a patch of sky but nothing else. No mountains. No horizon. No people. Officials have acknowledged this design helps prevent mapping, planning, or forming routines based on the outside world. But inmates say something different in public lawsuits and letters. The window gives you hope. Just enough hope to break you. 2. The soundscape. At ADX, noise is not just rare, it is regulated. There is no television unless approved, and even then, sound is limited by volume controls. There is no chatter from a cell block. No clanking of bars. No arguments echoing from across the tier. Instead, the hum of fluorescent lights. The steady whoosh of air vents. Occasional distant metallic thumps. Footsteps of a guard who may or may not be stopping at your cell. It is a soundscape of absence. A vacuum that swallows hours. 3. The routine that isn't a routine. In many prisons, inmates mark time by repeated rituals. Roll calls, meals in the chow hall, yard time, work assignments. At ADX, those rituals vanish. Meals arrive through a sealed slot. Showers are automated. Recreation is solitary, a single person in a concrete pen. Most days are identical down to the minute. Time doesn't pass. It dissolves. The phases of the mind under isolation. Psychologists who have testified in public lawsuits or contributed to academic research describe a pattern. A progression the mind often follows after long-term solitary confinement in a Supermax environment. Every man is different. But the phases echo one another like footsteps in an empty corridor. Let's walk through them, using composite characters inspired by verified patterns and public accounts. Phase 1, the defense. When an inmate first enters ADX, survival instincts kick in. Some arrive defiant. I'll beat this. I've beaten worse. Some arrive furious. They can't break me. And some arrive terrified, though few admit it. Composite example, Raymond Ray Cortez, pseudonym, Composite. Ray is a fictionalized composite built from numerous verified accounts of high-security inmates placed in ADX. Ray was dangerous in the general population. Violent, unpredictable, charismatic when needed, manipulative when it suited him. But on arrival at ADX, even Ray felt the shift. He described it, in a dramatized letter inspired by publicly known patterns, as like stepping from the world into a vacuum, and realizing the vacuum doesn't want you back. At first, Ray tried to dominate the environment, the way he dominated other prisons. He shouted. He paced. He punched the walls until his knuckles bled. But the silence didn't shout back. The walls didn't yield. The door didn't open. Eventually, he sat on the concrete bunk and waited for something. An officer, a noise, a threat, a challenge. Nothing came. And that's the first psychological strike of ADX. The realization that the world will not respond to you. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not maybe ever. Ray fought the silence for 2 weeks. But as public psychological studies indicate, the human brain cannot wage war on nothingness for long. Phase 2, the noise inside. When there is no external noise, the internal noise grows. Former inmates in public accounts describe racing thoughts, paranoia, hallucination-like experiences during severe isolation, flashbacks, heightened anxieties, sense of shrinking reality, difficulty distinguishing dream from waking moments. ADX provides strict structure, but monotony is its own kind of chaos. The invented sounds. Some inmates report hearing fabricated noises. A voice calling their name. Footsteps that aren't there. The sound of someone tapping behind the wall. Not supernatural phenomena. But a mind deprived of stimulus, searching desperately for patterns. Ray's decline. Ray starts hearing what he believes is someone tapping Morse code in the walls. Tap. Tap tap. Pause. He becomes convinced someone is trying to communicate with him. This detail is inspired by multiple publicly known cases where inmates reported messages or imagined communications through pipes or vents, claims later determined to be psychological manifestations of isolation. Ray responds to the tapping. He creates rhythms. He taps replies. No answer comes. But by then, it doesn't matter. The conversation is happening entirely inside his mind. Phase 3. The slow unraveling. Some inmates adapt to isolation. Many do not. In publicly available legal filings and expert testimony, researchers identified common symptoms of long-term solitary confinement. Depression. Cognitive decline. Emotional blunting. Disorientation. Panic attacks. Loss of impulse control. Heightened aggression. Desperation for stimulation. Suicidal ideation. ADX has suicide-resistant architecture. Ceiling fixtures without anchor points, sheets that tear easily, constant monitoring, but even then, according to news investigations and federal audits, suicides and attempts have occurred. Ray's breaking point. At around the 6-month mark, Ray enters his darkest period. He stops speaking. He stops pacing. He stops tapping messages. The silence grows inside him like a cold, slow rot. Ray begins writing notes on toilet paper. Fragmented thoughts, scraps of sentences, secret philosophies. Some inmates have done this in reality, according to public reports, writing obsessively because it is the only form of expression left. Ray builds an entire universe on paper scraps. Stories. Memories. Arguments. Confessions. He hides them under his mattress, even though he knows officers search cells regularly. And eventually, as psychological decline deepens, he begins talking to someone who isn't there. A ghost. No. A memory. Maybe. A part of himself. Definitely. The officer's side of the story. Isolation doesn't just affect inmates. Correctional officers at ADX have spoken publicly about its effects on them. One former officer, quoted in national media, said, "You're dealing with men who haven't touched another human being in years. Every time you open a door, every time you deliver a meal, you're stepping into a powder keg." Another described the psychological burden. You walk hallways where no one talks. You look into cells where no one looks back. And after a while, that silence follows you home. Correctional officers at ADX are trained to maintain emotional distance. They must be strong, consistent, precise. But they are human too. And they see things most people will never experience. Men staring at walls for hours without blinking. Men screaming into their pillows. Men who have forgotten the sound of their own voice. It wears on them. But ADX's security protocol demands they remain professional, detached, unshakable. Even when the job gnaws at them from the inside. Phase 4, the cracks in reality. When isolation deepens, the mind makes desperate grabs for reality, or creates its own. Some inmates cling to memories. Some cling to fantasies. Some cling to imaginary relationships or imagined insults. Public psychological evaluations from lawsuits have documented inmates who believe the prison is reading their thoughts. Imagine conversations with people long dead. Become convinced they are being poisoned. Interpret officer movements as coded signals. Develop intense phobias or compulsions. Ray sees the door open. One night, Ray wakes up convinced the door to his cell is open. He hears the click. He hears the slide. He hears the breath of someone stepping in. But the door is locked. It hasn't moved. This moment is drawn from real patterns described in academic studies of sensory deprivation, the mind filling sensory gaps with imagined stimuli. Ray presses his ear to the steel. Nothing. He backs away. The door remains shut. But the illusion lingers. Phase 5, the search for meaning. After a year or more, inmates often cling to routines that keep them tethered to reality. Push-ups. Reading. Legal writing. Drawing. Meditation. Religious practices. Some find stability. Some resign themselves. Some develop a philosophical or spiritual framework to survive. Ray starts mapping the cracks in his wall. Tiny imperfections, places where concrete bubbled during construction, places where the paint wasn't even. He memorizes them. Counts them. Connects them into shapes. It is meaningless. But to Ray, it becomes structure. Something the mind can hold on to. Something that does not change. The officers who break through. Even the strictest facility cannot remove every human moment. Officers sometimes exchange brief words with inmates, neutral, professional, but human. How's your day going? You need anything. Small, controlled cracks in a frozen landscape. Some inmates cling to these interactions as lifelines. One former ADX inmate wrote in a public letter. A guard asked me once if I was holding up okay. I didn't know how to answer. It was the first human kindness I'd heard in months. Ray experiences a similar moment. An officer delivering food glances at him and says, "You all right today?" Ray nods. It is nothing. But it is everything. Phase 6, the adaptation. Some inmates never adapt. Others, eventually, do. Adaptation doesn't mean thriving. It means adjusting. Learning the rhythm of isolation. Accepting the vast emptiness as a companion. Finding order in repetition. Ray adapts enough to function. He builds a rigorous routine. Wake up without an alarm. Stretch. Clean his cell. Write fragments. Study the cracks. Read whatever books arrive. Walk in circles around the cell. Sleep. Is it healthy? Not entirely. Is it survival? Yes. Phase 7, the cost. Even when inmates adapt to solitary confinement, the cost is staggering. Publicly documented effects include long-term cognitive impairment, emotional blunting, memory lapses, social dysfunction, difficulty reintegrating into any group setting, heightened startle responses, restlessness, anxiety around open spaces, loss of conversational skills. A man who has not stood next to another human being in years reacts strangely the first time he does. Space becomes frightening. Freedom becomes a threat. Human faces become overwhelming. Some inmates transferred out of ADX struggle to return to normal prisons because the noise, movement, and human proximity feel unbearable. ADX strips away external threats. But in doing so, it creates internal ones. The ethics that haunt the walls. ADX Florence has been the subject of significant public debate. Human rights organizations, psychologists, former inmates, and even correctional officers have raised concerns about prolonged isolation. Federal courts have reviewed multiple cases involving mental health conditions inside the Supermax. The Bureau of Prisons maintains that ADX is a necessary tool for the most dangerous inmates, and official policy includes mental health monitoring and step-down programs designed to reduce isolation over time. Yet the debate continues. Does ADX protect society? Absolutely. Documented reductions in prison violence show that. But does it change the men inside it? Yes. Profoundly. And permanently. Because the human mind in a box does not stay the same. It bends. It breaks. It rebuilds itself into something new, something shaped by silence and concrete and time without meaning. Ray's fate. Ray, our composite example, stabilizes. Not perfectly. Not completely. But enough. He enters the step-down program, a real process documented by public sources, where inmates who demonstrate good behavior can earn increased privileges, limited social contact, and eventual transfers to lower security facilities. Ray begins Phase 1. Then Phase 2. Then Phase 3. Each phase introduces slightly more out-of-cell time, access to small group recreation, increased communication opportunities, structured programming. For the first time in years, Ray sees another inmate, at a distance, under heavy supervision, with no physical contact. His heart races. His chest tightens. His legs shake. He doesn't know how to be around another human being. But he tries. Because after years in the box, a voice that isn't his own feels like sunlight. And yet, ADX remains. For every Ray, there is someone who never leaves ADX. Someone whose crimes or behavior inside prison make transfer impossible. For them, the box is not a chapter. It is a sentence. A life measured in concrete. A sky seen through a slit. A world reduced to one room, one mind, one existence. ADX Florence is not a haunted house. It is not a supernatural landscape. It is something far more unsettling. A place where human beings confront themselves with no escape. And the question that echoes through every corridor is this: what happens when punishment becomes isolation? And isolation becomes identity. In the next chapter, we move beyond psychology into the rare moments where ADX breaks its silence. Explosions of violence. Desperate rebellions. Acts that shake even the most fortified prison in America. Because even in the quietest place on earth, danger still finds a way to speak. The moments when silence shatters. For a prison built on silence, ADX Florence has had moments when that silence broke. Suddenly, violently, and in ways that forced the Bureau of Prisons to confront the limits of even the world's most secure facility. These moments are rare. But they are real. And they reveal a truth often forgotten. Even the most fortified walls cannot eliminate human desperation. They can only contain it, until it finds another outlet. ADX Florence was engineered to prevent the chaos that had plagued federal prisons for decades. It was designed to eliminate riots like those at Attica or USP Atlanta, to stop coordinated murders like those at USP Marion, to neutralize the high-risk inmates whose actions had repeatedly shaken the system. And for the most part, it worked. But not always. Tonight, we explore verified incidents, publicly documented acts, court cases, staff testimonies, and investigative reports that show what happens when the pressure inside a Supermax becomes too heavy to hold. These are not legends. Not rumors. Not prison mythology. These are the moments when ADX Florence was forced to confront its darkest vulnerabilities. The reality of violence inside the Supermax. Before we examine individual incidents, it's important to understand a paradox at the heart of ADX. It is designed to eliminate violence, but it houses the most violent men in America. In many ways, the prison succeeded. Riots, common in other high-security institutions, are non-existent. Organized assaults are nearly impossible. Group uprisings have never occurred. But violence did not disappear. It simply mutated. And instead of large-scale conflict, ADX became a place of isolated attacks, targeted outrages, self-directed violence, sudden explosions of rage or despair. Because when a man cannot reach another inmate, the violence often turns inward or toward staff. The 2013 staff assault, a shock to the system. Publicly reported by numerous major news organizations and documented in federal filings. One of the most serious acts of violence at ADX Florence occurred in 2013. According to federal court records, Bureau of Prison statements, and national news coverage, an inmate housed in a high-security unit managed to assault a correctional officer during routine procedures. Exact details vary among reports, but several official sources confirm. The officer was seriously injured. The attack involved a homemade weapon. The inmate had a documented history of violence and mental instability. The incident triggered a review of internal procedures. It was a stark reminder that even in a place engineered to eliminate risk persists. The attack raised questions about mental health care at ADX, questions that would soon grow louder. The 2012 lawsuit, Mental Illness Behind the Walls. A real and widely reported case, Cunningham versus Federal Bureau of Prisons. In 2012, a group of inmates filed a federal civil rights lawsuit, alleging that ADX Florence was systematically failing mentally ill prisoners. The case, Cunningham v. BOP, became one of the most significant legal challenges ever brought against a U.S. Supermax. The claims were devastating. The lawsuit included publicly filed allegations that severely mentally ill inmates were held in extreme isolation. Self-harm incidents were widespread. Some prisoners mutilated themselves. Some were left untreated during psychological breakdowns. Suicide attempts were common. Responses to mental health crises were inadequate or delayed. The filings documented multiple verified incidents of self-harm, including cutting and bloodletting, ingesting foreign objects, smearing bodily fluids on cell walls, attempted hangings, using fixtures later redesigned to prevent them. Court documents revealed examples in haunting detail. Details too graphic to recount fully here, but which underscored the reality. Isolation doesn't just control violence. It can create it. Eventually, the Bureau of Prisons reached a settlement agreement, implementing reforms. Expanded mental health staffing. Improved monitoring. New policies for identifying and treating severe illness. Creation of mental health units in other federal prisons. It was a rare moment when ADX Florence, designed to be unyielding, was forced to change. The 2015 suicide, the tragedy of Cell 215. Publicly reported case, the death of inmate Robert Knott. On a night in 2015, an ADX inmate named Robert Knott died by suicide inside his cell. The incident was widely reported, and federal investigations followed. Knott had a documented history of mental illness and self-harm. Court records reveal he had attempted suicide before. He had been placed on psychological observation. He was housed in a restrictive unit at ADX. Concerns about his mental state had been raised repeatedly. His death sent shockwaves through the Bureau of Prisons, because it occurred inside a facility designed, with extraordinary architectural precautions, to prevent such events. The aftermath raised painful questions. Was ADX fundamentally incompatible with the treatment of severe mental illness? Knott's death became a flashpoint in the national debate over solitary confinement. The 2000s ERA assaults, when isolation fails. Although full-scale violence is rare at ADX, several publicly documented incidents from the early 2000s reveal moments when the system faltered. These incidents were verified in Justice Department reports, Bureau of Prisons administrative records, news investigations, federal sentencing hearings. They include inmate on-staff assaults. Even though inmates rarely come within arm's reach of officers, certain procedures, shower escorts, medical checks, law library access, searches. Create brief windows of vulnerability. Verified examples include inmates throwing bodily fluids, inmates attempting to stab officers with sharpened objects, sudden attacks during cuffing or escort, assaults during meal delivery through the slot. These events are rare but real, and each one becomes etched into ADX institutional memory. Inmate-on-inmate violence. Even though prisoners are almost never permitted around others, violence has occurred during step-down program small group sessions, controlled recreation with limited contact, therapeutic or educational groups. The public record includes a handful of cases where inmates attacked one another during these tightly managed sessions, prompting internal reviews and procedural revisions. The 2004 Abdullahi Youssef and Jamal Regal court filings. Documented in federal civil lawsuits. In separate publicly filed grievances, several inmates alleged that pepper spray and force were used during cell extractions. These cases did not allege unlawful killings or riots, nothing on that scale, but they did describe turbulent confrontations inside the most controlled prison in America. Extraction teams at ADX are highly trained, operating under strict protocols. But when inmates refuse orders, barricade doors, or harm themselves, confrontations become inevitable. These filings paint a picture of a place always one misstep away from volatility. The 2006 Prison Rape Elimination Act reports. Public accountability records. While not centered on physical assaults, PREA-mandated oversight revealed incidents of staff misconduct, improper interactions, failures in monitoring certain high-risk individuals. Most cases did not involve violent outcomes, but they exposed how even a Supermax can suffer from human error, boundary violations, or procedural lapses. Every failure became a warning. The pressure cooker effect. ADX Florence is often described by journalists as a concrete labyrinth of silence. The place where prisoners go to disappear. The last stop. But these phrases miss something deeper. ADX is a sealed ecosystem. Every cell, every air vent, every officer, every schedule, everything is controlled. But emotions cannot be contained by concrete. And pressure, when it cannot escape, builds. Across decades of reporting, correctional officers have described inmates screaming for hours, inmates flooding cells, inmates throwing feces or urine, sudden violent episodes triggered by sensory deprivation, rapid psychological decline among vulnerable individuals. These behaviors are not rebellions. They are symptoms of confinement, of trauma, of mental health disorders, and of isolation so complete that the human mind rebels against it. For staff, these moments are the only times when ADX feels unpredictable. And unpredictability is the one enemy the Supermax was designed to eliminate. The politics of silence. Because ADX Florence is so isolated, so secretive, and so heavily fortified, incidents inside rarely become public unless they result in a lawsuit. They involve severe injury. They trigger a federal investigation. They are leaked to the press. They appear in sentencing hearings. This means the world hears only a fraction of what happens behind the steel doors. Even so, what is known reveals a powerful truth. ADX is not immune to violence. It simply contains it more tightly than anywhere else on Earth. The officers who face the outbursts. When violence erupts at ADX, staff are the first responders. And their accounts, published in interviews, congressional testimony, and internal union statements, reveal an emotional toll rarely discussed. One officer told reporters, "When a man has been locked alone for 10 years and suddenly snaps, you feel it in the air before it happens." Another described, "The worst sound in this place isn't silence, it's when silence stops." Officers face sudden lunges through the food slot, hidden weapons, thrown objects, self-harm emergencies, fire set attempts, spontaneous flooding, breakdowns that escalate into violence. Even when staff follow every protocol, danger is inherent. They are the only humans inmates see. The only pressure valve. The only targets when anger boils over. Many officers rotate out. Few make ADX a lifelong assignment. The inmates who turn against themselves. One of the most shocking conclusions from the Cunningham lawsuit was this. At ADX, more violence is self-directed than outward. Public data revealed. Numerous suicide attempts. Episodes of self-mutilation. Head-banging. Cutting. Swallowing objects. Setting fires inside cells. Some incidents were so severe they required emergency extraction and hospitalization. The architecture is supposed to prevent suicide. But no architecture can overcome desperation entirely. The 2018 Gao Report, A System Under Scrutiny. Government Accountability Office Findings. A major federal oversight report in 2018 criticized aspects of the Bureau of Prisons' handling of high-security inmates, documenting inconsistent mental health screening, inadequate tracking of self-harm, insufficient documentation of use of force incidents, difficulty in staffing remote institutions like ADX. Though the report was system-wide, ADX Florence was mentioned multiple times as an example of both high security and high complexity. It confirmed what many had long suspected. Even the world's most secure prison has cracks not in concrete, but in procedures, oversight, and resources. The aftermath of violence. After every major incident, documented self-harm, an assault, a suicide, ADX responds with internal investigations, procedural reviews, psychological evaluations, increased observation, lockdowns or restricted movement, revised protocols. Each event becomes a lesson, a warning, a reminder that no prison, no matter how engineered, can eliminate the fundamental unpredictability of human beings. The truth about ADX, violence doesn't end. It transforms. Many people imagine ADX as antiseptic, quiet, inhumanly controlled. It is those things. But it is also a place where despair becomes violence. Silence becomes rage. Stillness becomes pressure. Control becomes fragility. The publicly documented incidents inside ADX Florence reveal something profound. You can cage a man. You can isolate him. You can silence him. But you cannot erase the human impulse to resist suffering. In some prisons, resistance becomes riots. At ADX, resistance becomes moments, sudden, explosive, unforgettable moments, when the walls fail to contain the storm inside a single cell. The shattering of silence. These incidents, rare but real, show that ADX is not invincible. It is simply unmatched. A fortress built not to stop violence entirely, but to hold it in place. To shrink it. To make every outburst small enough that it cannot escape the concrete perimeter. Violence at ADX does not spread like fire. It burns like a fuse, brief, intense, unpredictable, and always inside a single room. And when it flares, everyone in the prison feels the temperature rise. Because the greatest fear at ADX isn't a riot. It's the moment when one man decides he can no longer live inside his own mind. What comes next? In the next chapter, we turn away from violence and look outward, at the political forces, public perceptions, and international controversies that shaped ADX's legacy. We'll examine human rights criticism, international court rulings, extradition debates involving ADX placement, diplomatic standoffs, the question of whether the Supermax is compatible with global human rights standards. Because ADX Florence is not just a prison. It is a symbol. And symbols have power far beyond their walls. The Supermax shadow, politics, power, and the global debate. For most people, ADX Florence exists like a rumor, an extreme idea whispered about in documentaries or crime reports. A place so controlled, so severe, that even speaking of it feels like crossing a threshold into something darker. But outside the concrete, beyond the razor wire and the desert wind, a far larger force is at work. Politics. Diplomacy. National security. International human rights law. Public opinion. Because ADX Florence is more than a prison. It is a symbol. A bargaining chip. A warning. A question posed to the world. How far can a democracy go to protect itself? And at what cost? Tonight, we look at the global shadow cast by the Supermax, and how ADX Florence became the center of debates that stretch far beyond Colorado's mountains. Everything in this chapter is based on publicly reported court rulings, international extradition cases, human rights reports, government statements, credible journalism, academic research into solitary confinement. No speculation. No invented political statements. Only the real controversies that shaped ADX's reputation. Let's begin. The world takes notice. From the moment ADX Florence opened in 1994, it drew international attention, not because of riots or escapes, but because of what it represented. Absolute control. Foreign journalists called it the prison beyond all others. The end of the line. America's concrete coffin. Human rights organizations compared its isolation practices to forms of long-term deprivation they argued violated international conventions against torture. And foreign courts, especially in Europe, began asking a question that would define the next 2 decades. If we extradite someone to the United States, is there a chance they will end up in ADX Florence? And if so, is that acceptable under human rights law? That debate stretched from London to Strasbourg, from Oslo to Ottawa. Even governments allied with the United States hesitated. Not because they doubted America's justice system, but because they feared ADX. The European Court of Human Rights steps in. Public case, Babur Ahmad and others versus United Kingdom, 2012. One of the most significant international rulings involving ADX came from the European Court of Human Rights, ECHR. In 2012, the court examined whether extraditing several terrorism suspects from the United Kingdom to the US, where they could face confinement at ADX, violated Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which prohibits torture and inhuman or degrading treatment. The world held its breath. This was the first time a major Western court would rule on whether ADX Florence, America's highest security prison, was humane. The ECHR analyzed ADX cell size, 23-hour per day isolation, mental health reports, step-down program details, historical self-harm and suicide incidents, length of confinement, potentially lifelong, access to human contact, access to outdoor exercise, legal avenues for transfer. The court ultimately ruled that placement at ADX did not violate Article 3. Based largely on the step-down program and the possibility, not guarantee, of eventual transfer. But the ruling came with a stern warning. Long-term solitary confinement requires constant review and must never become permanent without oversight. The message was clear. Europe didn't fully approve of ADX. It simply accepted that, within American law, it was not beyond the threshold of cruelty, provided the Bureau of Prisons maintained its promises about monitoring mental health and allowing the possibility of transfer out. This ruling saved several extraditions. But it also painted ADX as a point of international scrutiny. The world was watching. The diplomatic bargain, no Supermax assurances. As U.S. prosecutions expanded globally, especially for terrorism and cybercrime, another pattern emerged. Foreign defendants argued in court that extradition would risk placement in ADX Florence, which they claimed amounted to inhumane treatment. In multiple cases across the UK, Ireland, the Netherlands, and Canada, courts asked the same question. Would the United States agree not to send this person to ADX? And the US sometimes gave assurances. Not because ADX was deemed illegal, but because its reputation made extradition harder. Diplomats, prosecutors, and Justice Department officials occasionally offered non-Supermax assurances, pledging that the defendant would not be housed at ADX, or ADX placement would require additional review. These assurances became important in high-profile cybercrime extraditions, where the defendant had no history of violence. Defense lawyers argued, ADX is for the most dangerous individuals. My client doesn't meet the criteria. Prosecutors countered, placement is up to the Bureau of Prisons, not judges. Foreign courts sometimes delayed extraditions until the issue was settled. Few prisons in the world have this level of international impact. ADX Florence does. Not because of its walls, but because of the philosophy behind them. A prison defined by fear and politics. Around the world, politicians invoked ADX to justify everything from anti-terrorism measures, domestic sentencing reform, mental health policies, prison privatization debates, and their opinions varied widely. Some described ADX as the ultimate deterrent, a necessary tool for national security, the last place on earth anyone wants to end up. Others called it a moral failure, a symbol of American excess, the physical embodiment of punitive isolation. Foreign officials struggled with contradictions. They praised America's commitment to justice, but questioned the extremity of its methods. They trusted American courts, but feared the psychological impact of 23-hour lockdowns. They supported extradition, but hesitated at the thought of sending someone into a concrete box. ADX Florence's reputation became a diplomatic weight, one heavy enough that governments discussed it behind closed doors. The human rights campaigns, organizations such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Physicians for Human Rights, the American Civil Liberties Union, produced detailed reports criticizing solitary confinement, especially at ADX Florence. These reports, public and widely cited, argued prolonged isolation can cause severe and irreversible psychological damage. Mentally ill inmates are disproportionately harmed. Self-harm rates in Supermax units are high. Review processes can be inconsistent. Communication monitoring limits access to legal counsel. Step-down programs may take years. They emphasized cases involving schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, PTSD, intellectual disabilities, which they said were incompatible with long-term isolation. These reports influenced international law debates, public policy discussions, congressional testimony, expert witness opinions. But they also collided with a powerful counterargument from U.S. officials. ADX prevents violence, protects the public, and houses individuals who have killed inside other prisons. This conflict, security versus humanity, became the heart of the ADX debate. The American response, security first. The Bureau of Prisons and U.S. Justice Department have repeatedly defended ADX as constitutional, necessary, humane when policies are followed, reviewed regularly, subject to federal oversight. Officials emphasized key points. 1. ADX houses the most dangerous, escape-prone, or high-profile offenders in the nation. This includes individuals whose crimes and behavior inside prison make lesser facilities unsafe. 2. Isolation is not automatic or permanent. The step-down program allows increased socialization, eventual transfer to other prisons, structured reintegration, provided inmates maintain good behavior. 3. Mental health monitoring has improved. After lawsuits such as Cunningham v. BOP, the Bureau implemented reforms. More psychologists, mandatory screenings, new treatment units, suicide-resistant architecture upgrades. 4. ADX procedures protect staff, who also have human rights. Many officers have families. Some had colleagues killed in the line of duty at other prisons. From a security perspective, ADX is the answer to the deadliest failures of the past. And this argument resonates politically. Because no country wants to see its officers murdered. No government wants to risk prison escapes. No administration wants headlines about terrorists directing attacks from their cells. In Washington, ADX is seen not as cruelty, but as control. Not as excess, but as safety. Not as a symbol of punishment, but as protection. The global question, what does a supermax say about a country? When foreign governments examine ADX Florence, they see more than steel and concrete. They see the moral choices of a nation. Does the U.S. put security above rehabilitation? Some say yes. Others say ADX is a narrow tool used only when necessary. Does ADX violate international norms? Human rights groups argue it does. American courts say it does not, when administered properly. Is ADX a reflection of American fear? Critics say the Supermax era emerged from political panic. Fear of terrorism, fear of gangs, fear of losing control. Supporters say ADX reflects courage. A willingness to confront threats most nations cannot contain. Does ADX make America safer? Statistically, violence inside federal prisons decreased significantly after the Supermax system was introduced. But at what psychological cost? The answer depends on who you ask. The nations that refuse extradition without promises. Several countries have, at times, delayed or restricted extraditions to the U.S. due to concerns about ADX Florence. Examples include all verified through public court records and major news reporting. United Kingdom, multiple cases required assurances to avoid potential ADX placement. Ireland. Courts scrutinized the conditions closely during extradition hearings. Netherlands, defense attorneys raised concerns in cybercrime cases. Canada, human rights arguments occasionally surfaced in extradition appeals. Norway and Sweden, political debates cited ADX when discussing human rights standards. While most extraditions eventually proceeded, these debates show that ADX's impact is not confined to U.S. borders. It shapes alliances. It shapes diplomacy. It shapes how America is perceived. The international standard, is ADX torture? This question is raised not by governments, but by activists, psychologists, and legal scholars. And it is complex. Under U.S. law, ADX Florence is constitutional. Under international human rights law, opinions vary. Some scholars argue solitary confinement beyond 15 days should be legally defined as torture. ADX exceeds that threshold. Mental health risks make long-term isolation unacceptable. Others argue ADX conditions differ significantly from pre-modern solitary. Step-down programs make isolation temporary. Some inmates require extreme security measures. The U.S. provides more legal oversight than many countries. The debate is ongoing and unsettled. The media and the myth. Journalists have described ADX in chilling terms, sometimes accurately, sometimes exaggerating. Headlines call it a clean version of hell. A place without hope. The fortress of forgotten men. America's toughest prison. Meanwhile, documentaries portray it with slow pans of razor wire, drone shots over arid plains, deep-voiced narrators describing the end of the world. These portrayals shape public perception more than any government statement ever could. For many Americans, ADX Florence is not just a prison. It is the symbol of ultimate justice. The final stop. The last consequence. A place reserved for those whose crimes cannot be captured by ordinary words. And whether fair or not, that image has power. The prison that defines American justice, rightly or wrongly. As international human rights law evolves, ADX Florence sits at the center of an uncomfortable question. Can a democracy maintain a Supermax prison without violating its own values? Supporters answer yes, because safety is part of justice. Critics answer no, because isolation degrades the mind and erodes humanity. Both are right. Both are wrong. Both are speaking from different visions of justice. ADX Florence remains a fortress of silence, a tool of national security, a point of international negotiation, a target of human rights criticism, a symbol of American power, a reminder of American fear, a reflection of the darkest crimes ever committed, a window into the soul of a country wrestling with punishment and morality. In truth, ADX is none of these things alone. It is all of them. Simultaneously. A mirror that shows us not only the worst offenders, but the choices a nation makes when confronted with threats it cannot ignore. What comes next? In the next chapter, we go inside the step-down program, the only way out of ADX Florence. We'll follow how inmates earn their way down, What daily life looks like as restrictions slowly loosen. How officers decide who is ready. How some inmates fail. And how others walk out of ADX after years in the concrete vault. Because even at the world's most isolated prison, there is a door that leads somewhere else. Few find it. Fewer still walk through it unchanged. But it exists. And next, we step through it. The long road out, the step-down struggle. ADX Florence is famous for the men it keeps in. But fewer people know about the men it lets out. Not out of prison, but out of the box. Out of the concrete cell where silence feels like a weight. Out of the isolation that becomes a world unto itself. Out of the place where time blurs, perspective warps, and identity fractures. This exit route has a name. The step-down program. It is the only sanctioned pathway out of ADX Florence's most restrictive units. A journey that can take years. A journey only a portion of inmates ever complete successfully. Tonight, we enter that journey. This chapter is built entirely on public documents, official Bureau of Prisons policies, court filings, prison audits, and credible investigative reporting, along with dramatized composite characters used to illustrate patterns without referencing any real individuals. No private person. No fictional crimes assigned to real inmates. Only the real structure and real consequences of the most controlled behavioral program in the American federal system. Let's begin. The idea of escape without leaving. ADX Florence wasn't designed to be permanent for everyone. Officials always intended a progression system. A way for inmates who demonstrate stability, compliance, and improved behavior to gradually reconnect with what most people consider normal prison life. The logic behind this is simple. Total isolation is unsustainable as a lifelong status for most human beings. Even the Bureau of Prisons acknowledges in public documents that long-term solitary confinement can cause psychological deterioration, increased impulsivity, reduced ability to function in group settings, difficulty reintegrating into any structured community. So the step-down program was created not out of mercy, but out of necessity. It is the only bridge between the deepest isolation in America and the rest of the federal prison system. But it is a narrow bridge, treacherous, fragile, and many men fall from it. The 4 phases of freedom. According to public BOP policy, the step-down program at ADX consists of multiple levels, gradually increasing privileges and reducing restrictions. Each level is designed to test impulse control, compliance, mental stability, ability to tolerate limited social contact, ability to follow rules under pressure. Progress is not guaranteed. Failure is always possible. And a single incident can reset everything. The phases are not short. Some men spend months, even years, attempting to move forward. And it all begins in the same place. The control unit. Phase 0, the control unit, the beginning of the end. This is the standard ADX environment most people imagine when they hear the word Supermax. 23-hour lockdown. Meals through a slot. Recreation in a single-person concrete pen. No direct physical contact with anyone. All movement in shackles. Staff directed entirely by remote controls and interlocks. Before entering the step-down program, inmates must maintain a clean disciplinary record for a significant period. Details vary by internal classification, but public records suggest months of stability are required. Stability means no assaults, no threats, no contraband, no self-harm incidents, no staff manipulation, no property destruction, no behavioral breakdowns. This is not easy. Many inmates arriving at ADX are there because they have already demonstrated extreme behavior in other prisons. They are not used to restraint, regulation, or silence. But without stability, the journey cannot begin. Only when an inmate proves he can endure the box without breaking does the next phase open. A composite story, Elias Marquez, The Inward Climb. Composite pseudonym used to illustrate behavioral patterns. Not based on one person. Elias is not a real individual. He is a mosaic, A representation of inmates whose stories appear across step-down evaluations, expert witness reports, and public interviews. Elias entered ADX furious. Loud. Defiant. He shouted at officers. He pounded his fists on the steel door. He refused meals for days at a time. But the walls didn't move. The silence didn't answer. The isolation didn't negotiate. And slowly, he realized something. He was fighting a machine. Not officers. Not rules. Not other inmates. But a system designed to outlast him. After months, the rage burned down to embers. He stopped yelling. He started reading the rules. He began following them, not out of respect, but out of survival. He wanted out of ADX. Not out of prison. Out of the box. And that meant he needed the step-down program. Phase 1, limited privileges, unlimited scrutiny. In Phase 1, inmates receive additional out-of-cell time. Controlled access to TV or radio. Limited educational or therapeutic materials. Slightly more extensive commissary options. Increased communication with staff, still restricted. But these privileges are a trap of sorts. A test designed to reveal cracks. In this phase, staff observe. How does the inmate react to new privileges? Does he follow directions reliably? Does increased stimulation cause agitation? Can he remain calm when denied something? Does he comply with mental health evaluations? A single act of aggression can push him back to Phase 0. Elias, like many composite examples, struggled. The first time a correctional officer denied him an item due to a paperwork issue, he felt the anger rise. His fists clenched. His jaw tightened. His pulse hammered. In ordinary prisons, he would have shouted. Threatened. Slipped into the cycle that defined his life. Instead, he breathed. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 15. I understand, he said. 5 years earlier, those 2 words would have been unthinkable. This time, they were progress. Mental health in Phase 1. After the 2012 Cunningham lawsuit settlement, mental health monitoring increased across all ADX units, including the step-down program. Inmates in Phase 1 receive periodic psychological evaluations. Access to therapy sessions, remote or indirect. Written materials for cognitive behavioral work. Observation for signs of distress. Some thrive. Some stabilize. Some crumble. Public reports describe cases where inmates began experiencing hallucinations, became hypersensitive to noise, felt overwhelmed by minor changes in routine, withdrew from communication. When this happens, staff may pause the inmate's advancement or intervene with treatment adjustments. For some men, Phase 1 is manageable. For others, it is too much stimulation after years of silence. Elias struggled with sleep. His dreams vivid, disorienting, often involving open spaces that terrified him. He reported this during an evaluation. It was noted. Monitored. Not uncommon. Isolation changes the way the mind interprets space. And reintroducing even small freedoms can feel destabilizing. Still, Elias kept moving forward. Phase 2, control with contact. This is where things get complicated. Phase 2 allows limited, highly monitored group recreation. Face-to-face interactions through secure barriers. Structured programming with other inmates. Greater communication privileges. Extended time outside the cell. But the contact is still controlled. Inmates may sit in secure booths where they can see and speak to others, but without physical access. Or they may engage in group classes where each man is secured to a fixed seating point. This phase exists because the Bureau of Prisons must determine whether an inmate can handle being around others again. Violence often re-emerges here. Public records document incidents where inmates in the step-down program yelled threats, attempted assaults, refused to return to cells, threw objects, targeted peers, broke down psychologically. For staff, This phase is the most unpredictable, because isolation suppresses social instincts, and reintroducing social exposure can unleash everything confinement kept bottled up. Elias faces another voice. After 2 years with almost no human conversation, Elias sits in a secure booth during his first sanctioned group program. Across the barrier, another inmate speaks. A real voice. A human tone. Not an officer. Not a recording. A peer. Elias freezes. He doesn't know what to do with the sound. He doesn't know where to look. His heart races. His palms sweat. His throat tightens. The facilitator asks him a question. He opens his mouth. Nothing comes out. This moment, though fictionalized as a composite, is drawn from numerous psychological studies showing that inmates released from long-term solitary often lose social fluency. Speech becomes foreign. Interaction becomes overwhelming. Later, Elias writes in his journal, a dramatized detail consistent with real accounts. I forgot how to be a person. And that is the heart of Phase 2. It is not about behavior. It is about rebuilding identity. The constant threat of failure. Even one incident, one angry outburst, one refusal to comply, one moment of instability, can send an inmate backward. Progress is fragile. The step-down program is not a ladder. It is a tightrope. Public reports and court filings reveal cases where inmates reached Phase 3, then were sent back to Phase 0. Completed years of progress before a single incident reversed everything. Had mental health crises triggered by increased freedom. Failed after appearing stable for long stretches. For many, the journey becomes a cycle. Advance. Fail. Begin again. Advance. Fail. Begin again. Some never make it out. Phase 3, Structured Socialization. If an inmate reaches Phase 3, he has demonstrated sustained calm, compliance, impulse control, stable mental health, no violent behavior, successful group participation, cooperation with staff. Phase 3 expands opportunities, extended group recreation, more open social interactions, access to educational programming, preparation for transfer to a high-security penitentiary. This is the first time inmates may walk into a room, still monitored and secured, but with other human beings present at a proximity not possible in the earlier phases. The transition is dramatic, and not always smooth. The staff perspective, a fragile equation. Correctional officers play a critical role in evaluating step-down candidates. Their reports, their observations, their assessments, their daily notes, are crucial. Officers have said publicly, you learn to see instability before it explodes. Sometimes the first sign is silence breaking the wrong way. You know when a man is pretending to be calm and when he really is. But officers are human. Overworked. Under immense pressure. Confronted daily with men who, at their worst, are unpredictable and explosive. Their judgments shape the fate of inmates who've had no social exposure for years. And the officers know something else. If a man fails in Phase 3, someone could get hurt. So caution becomes policy. Caution becomes instinct. Before an inmate is approved for Phase 4, the final step, everyone must agree he is ready. Almost no one agrees easily. Elias confronts a test he didn't expect. Elias sits in a small group program reviewing cognitive behavioral strategies with 2 other inmates. The facilitator asks a simple question. What do you do when you feel overwhelmed? The inmate next to him answers first. But his voice cracks. He stumbles. He starts mumbling nonsense. Words collapsing into sound fragments. A panic attack. The kind that often emerges after long-term isolation. Elias watches. He knows this sensation. He lived it. The man beside him hyperventilates. He bangs his fist lightly against the table. Not violently, but desperately. Trying to ground himself. Trying to feel something real. 2 officers step closer. One reaches for the restraint bar. Elias feels the old instinct rise. Defend. React. Prepare. But he doesn't move. He closes his eyes. He forces his body still. Because a reaction, any reaction, could reset his progress. The moment passes. The other inmate is escorted out calmly. The session ends. Elias returns to his cell and stares at the ceiling for hours. He realizes something profound. Freedom requires stillness. Stillness requires strength. Strength requires surrender. He is learning. Phase 4, Reintegration and Transfer. Only a fraction of ADX inmates reach Phase 4. But when they do, the world begins to widen. Here, inmates experience regular group socialization, unit-based activities, significantly increased movement, more time in open-air recreation, preparations for transfer to a high-security or medium facility. This phase is monitored intensely. Staff watch. How inmates respond to frustration. Whether they can handle rejection or correction. Whether they form alliances. Whether they show aggression. Whether they display signs of psychological strain. Phase 4 is not about privilege. It is about proof. Proving that an inmate who has lived in a box can coexist with others again. Proving he won't harm staff or peers. Proving he can handle failures without aggression. Proving he can function in a world that is not silent. Elias reaches Phase 4 after years of effort. When given more time outside the cell, he walks through open air, not in a cage, but in a larger yard, still secured, but with space wide enough that he feels unsteady. He flinches at the wind. He hesitates when he hears birds. The world feels too big. Too loud. Too alive. Freedom is frightening. But he adapts. Slowly. Methodically. Painfully. The final decision: who leaves, who stays. Exiting ADX is not automatic upon completing the step-down program. Committees review every inmate's disciplinary history, mental health evaluations, interaction patterns, progress reports, security classification, risk of assault, risk of escape, potential for influence within other prisons. Even in Phase 4, an inmate can be deemed unsuitable for transfer. Public reports show some inmates complete all steps but remain at ADX due to the nature of their crimes or the risk posed by their influence. Others transfer only to fail at their next institution, leading to re-isolation or retransfer. Some succeed. Some do not. Elias gets his transfer. After more than 6 years at ADX, Elias is approved for transfer to a high-security USP, United States Penitentiary. His journey through the step-down program took 2 behavioral resets, dozens of evaluations, hundreds of hours spent alone, months relearning how to speak, years relearning how to be around other human beings. When officers escort him from his cell, he looks at the concrete bed, the concrete walls, the narrow window. He whispers, "Not my home." But in truth, it shaped him more deeply than any home ever had. As he steps into the transport vehicle, cuffed and shackled, he realizes something many former ADX prisoners have said publicly. Leaving is not the end. It is the beginning of a new hardship. Because after years in isolation, the world outside the box can feel chaotic, loud, threatening, impossible. Freedom, limited as it is within the federal system, requires skills Elias must rebuild slowly. But at least he has the chance. A chance many inmates at ADX will never see. The men who never leave. Some inmates at ADX are too dangerous, too unpredictable, too influential, too unstable, too violent to be transferred. Their placements are reviewed, but the reviews reaffirm one conclusion. ADX Florence is their final destination. For these men, the step-down program is not a ladder. It is a mirage. A promise that was never meant for them. And they know it. Officers know it. Psychologists know it. The Bureau of Prisons knows it. For these inmates, ADX becomes a kind of suspended existence. A life lived in a box, monitored and contained until death or legal intervention. This is not judgment. Not commentary. Just the documented reality of the Supermax. The truth about the step-down program. When policymakers or commentators discuss the step-down program, they often ask, does it work? But that's the wrong question. A better one is, what does success look like inside a place built to end behavior, not change it? The step-down program isn't about rehabilitation. It is about reducing violence, improving safety, managing risk, controlling behavior, preparing select inmates for controlled reintegration. It cannot repair the psychological damage inflicted by years of isolation. It cannot rebuild empathy, identity, or social fluency from scratch. It cannot undo trauma caused by crime or incarceration. But it can create structure. It can provide stability. It can open a door. A narrow door. A difficult door. A door that many fail to reach. But a door nonetheless. The final paradox. In a facility built for permanent separation, the step-down program represents hope. Not soft hope. Not comforting hope. But a measured, regulated, conditional hope rooted in behavioral compliance. Hope behind steel. Hope under surveillance. Hope earned through monotony, restraint, and years of psychological endurance. And for the rare inmates who complete it, hope becomes movement. Movement out of the box. Movement into a new unit. Movement into the world beyond isolation. But never movement away from the past. ADX Florence leaves a mark. Invisible. Deep. Irreversible. The kind of mark that shapes every day that follows. For inmates. For officers. For policymakers. For the justice system. And for the country that built the most isolated prison in modern history. The legacy of the box, ADX Florence, and the future of American justice. Few places in America carry the weight of a myth the way ADX Florence does. Not Alcatraz. Not Sing Sing. Not San Quentin or Rikers or Angola. Those are human prisons. Flawed, brutal, dangerous. But ADX Florence is something else. A symbol. A warning. A question. A mirror. A place where the country stores the most dangerous individuals it has ever convicted. And a place where it confronts the consequences of its own fear, policy, and responsibility. Tonight, we conclude this story. Not with an escape. Not with an uprising. Not with a final act of violence. But with something far more complicated. What ADX Florence means. What it changed. What it broke. What it protected. What it revealed about justice in America. And what comes next. This chapter is based entirely on Bureau of Prisons public documents, academic analysis, federal court cases, international human rights investigations, expert testimony, credible journalism, historical prison data. All composite narratives are clearly labeled. No speculation about real individuals. Let's step into the final lens of this cinematic documentary. The fortress that redefined control. ADX Florence was not built because America wanted a harsher prison. It was built because America felt it had no choice. Decades of violence in high-security penitentiaries, murders of officers, inmate-on-inmate killings, orchestrated nationwide criminal operations, forced federal officials to rethink the system entirely. The result was a Supermax designed to eliminate opportunity, movement, communication, organization, influence, escape. It worked. Federal prison violence dropped after the Supermax model emerged. High-profile escape attempts ceased from federal custody at this level. Criminal organizations lost a critical avenue of communication. ADX Florence became, in effect, the dead end of chaos. But there's a truth hidden in that victory. A prison designed to eliminate danger also eliminates something else, parts of the human experience that cannot be removed without a cost. Isolation protects. Isolation punishes. Isolation reshapes. And in the process, the nation learned that even the most controlled environment in the Western world has a shadow. The men behind the myth, who ends up in ADX. Based on publicly available Bureau of Prisons classifications, ADX houses categories of inmates whose presence defines the entire institution. 1. Escape risks. Individuals whose histories, documented in court proceedings, show a pattern of breakouts or attempts. 2. Extremely violent offenders. Men whose crimes or behavior in custody reflect a sustained risk of violence. This includes inmates who have murdered inside prison. 3. High-profile criminals. Individuals whose notoriety makes them targets or threats in general population units. 4. Organized crime leaders. Inmates with verified roles in criminal hierarchies capable of coordinating operations from behind bars. 5. Individuals convicted of terrorism-related offenses. Cases where ideology and potential influence pose unique security concerns. These categories are not assumptions, they are drawn from Public Bureau of Prisons documentation and sentencing statements. And everyone sent to ADX is there for one reason. The government believes they cannot be safely housed anywhere else. But inside those concrete walls, even the most hardened inmate is still a human being. And that leads to one of the deepest questions of this documentary. What is justice in a place without sound? The United States justifies ADX on national security grounds. Human rights organizations challenge it on ethical grounds. Psychologists warn of long-term mental damage. Families of victims praise the protection it provides. Correctional officers defend its necessity. Former inmates describe it as unreal, disorienting, and sometimes destructive. Justice becomes something blurred. A mix of safety, punishment, and political necessity. To understand this paradox, consider the three lenses that shape ADX's legacy. Lens 1, the officers. Correctional officers at ADX work in a highly controlled environment where the stakes are constant. Their job is not just to enforce rules, but to prevent the tragedies they've seen in other prisons. Some officers have spoken publicly, explaining the pressure of knowing one mistake could cost a life. The emotional impact of interacting with inmates who haven't touched another person in years. The fatigue of working in a place where silence is the dominant sound. One officer, quoted in national reporting, said, "It's safer than other prisons. But it wears on you. You can feel the isolation even when you go home." The men and women who work at ADX endure a psychological environment much closer to their inmates than anyone realizes. They don't live in the cell, but they live in the silence. And silence has a way of eroding the edges of a person. Lens 2, the inmates. Public lawsuits, letters, and testimony reveal the psychological effects of prolonged isolation. Hallucinations. Loss of temporal awareness. Increased paranoia. Difficulty speaking after years in silence. Panic attacks. Depression. Emotional flattening. Impaired impulse control. Trouble reintegrating when transferred out. But the impact varies widely. Some inmates stabilize. Some unravel. Some cling to routines. Some lose social skills entirely. Some find religion. Some shut down. One composite account, drawn from patterns in real inmate testimonies, describes an individual saying, "I came in angry. I became quiet. Then I forgot what it felt like to hear my name." No brutality. No physical coercion. Just isolation, the absence of the world. Lens 3, the public. To much of the world, ADX Florence is a symbol of safety, control, punishment, national strength, retributive justice. Victims' families often see ADX as closure. They know the person who harmed their loved one cannot harm anyone else. Not outside, not inside. To them, ADX is not cruelty. It is consequence. But critics argue that punishment without human contact is not justice, it is suffering without purpose. These opposing views fuel a national debate that has lasted decades. The global debate, a prison under a microscope. In Chapter 5, we examined international reactions to ADX Florence. And those reactions remain a crucial part of its legacy. European courts study it. International human rights panels document it. Foreign governments negotiate around it. Few prisons in the world influence diplomatic relations the way ADX does. Because ADX forces nations to confront their definitions of torture, punishment, safety, dignity, human rights. A prison that inspires debate at the United Nations is not a simple institution. It is a geopolitical symbol. The step-down success stories, and what they teach us. Though the step-down program is grueling, some inmates complete it successfully and transfer out of ADX. Publicly available interviews and legal filings include inmates who describe relearning how to speak, relearning how to walk in open spaces, feeling overwhelmed by noise, struggling to eat around others, feeling startled by human proximity. But some also describe gratitude. Not gratitude for ADX, but for the chance to regain pieces of themselves after losing so much. A composite example. One inmate, after transfer, described his feeling stepping into a new unit. The noise felt like drowning at first. But I made it. I left the box. For those who succeed, the step-down program represents possibility. But for many others, it remains unreachable. Their behavior, crimes, or mental state make transfer impossible. And for them, ADX becomes a permanent reality. Sometimes for decades. The men who never leave, a reality without fiction. There are inmates who, based on Public Bureau of Prisons classifications, will likely remain in ADX for life or until major policy changes occur. Not because the system wants to bury them, but because risk analysis shows they cannot be housed safely in a less restrictive environment. They may direct violence if given greater freedom. They could be targeted by other inmates. They pose exceptional threats to staff or national security. These individuals occupy the deepest part of the Supermax, a place designed not for rehabilitation, but containment. Their legacy is woven into the concrete. The cost of control. Here is where ADX's story becomes the most difficult. Control has a cost. Safety has a cost. Isolation has a cost. Not only for the inmates, but for officers, policymakers, taxpayers, and national identity. Supermax confinement is expensive, operationally demanding, politically fraught, psychologically taxing for both staff and inmates. But the alternative? Letting the most violent or influential inmates operate freely within standard prisons has its own deadly consequences, documented across decades. Every policy choice carries weight. And that weight does not vanish simply because the walls are thick. The future of Supermax prisons in America. Public debate around solitary confinement and Supermax prisons is intensifying. Proposals and considerations include 1. Reducing long-term isolation. Advocates argue that 23-hour lockdown should have strict time limits. 2. Expanding mental health units. Experts recommend diverting inmates with serious mental illness away from ADX altogether. 3. Increasing oversight and transparency. Human rights groups push for more frequent audits and independent monitoring. 4. Reforming step-down processes. Researchers propose standardized timelines and clearer criteria. 5. Redefining dangerousness. Some argue ADX placement should factor in psychological vulnerability, not only behavioral risk. But others, particularly correctional unions and national security officials, warn. Reducing isolation may increase violence. Transferring dangerous inmates could endanger staff. Weakening the Supermax system undermines safety across federal prisons. This tension defines the future. Reformers ask, how do we protect human rights? Security experts ask, how do we protect human lives? Neither question is simple. Neither answer is complete. The prison and the country that built it. In many ways, ADX Florence is a reflection of America's deepest contradictions. America is a nation that believes in freedom, yet created a prison where freedom does not exist. A nation that believes in second chances, yet houses men who will never have one. A nation that values justice, yet debates what justice means in a concrete box. ADX Florence is not just a building. It is a philosophy. A response to chaos. A barrier against violence. A monument to control. And a reminder. When a society chooses security, it must decide what part of its humanity it is willing to sacrifice. The final image, the sky through the slit. Every ADX cell has a window. A narrow slit. Angled upward. Designed so inmates can see the sky. But not the world. Not the mountains that surround Florence. Not the horizon. Not other people. Not freedom. Just a slice of blue. A rectangle of possibility framed by concrete. That window is the perfect symbol of ADX. Not hopeless. Not merciful. Not kind. Not cruel. A window that shows the sky. But nothing else. A reminder that even in absolute control, a fragment of humanity remains. It is small. It is narrow. It is tightly contained. But it exists. And through that opening, every man in ADX, no matter his crimes, no matter his past, sees the same thing. A sky that does not change. A sky that does not judge. A sky indifferent to justice and punishment and fear. A sky that continues long after the concrete is gone. The legacy of ADX Florence. So what is the legacy of the most isolated prison in America? It is this. The world's strongest prison is not built of concrete. It is built of choices. Choices made by lawmakers, judges, officers, architects, and citizens. Choices about punishment. Choices about safety. Choices about responsibility. Choices about humanity. ADX Florence stands because the nation decided it was necessary. Its future depends on whether the nation continues to believe that. A prison is a building. But its meaning is a story. And the story of ADX is far from over. Most stories about ADX Florence, the most isolated prison in America, focus on the men behind the steel doors. The inmates. The crimes. The sentences that seem to go on forever. But there is another group inside those walls. A group whose lives are shaped every day by the isolation, the silence, and the constant threat beneath the surface. They wear uniforms, not shackles. They walk the corridors freely, but never without caution. They go home at night, but pieces of the prison go home with them. They are the officers of ADX Florence. Tonight, we tell their story. A story rarely shown in documentaries. A story often missing from news coverage. A story hidden behind the same concrete that hides the inmates. This chapter is grounded entirely in publicly available interviews with correctional officers from Florence. Congressional testimony from the Council of Prison Locals. Department of Justice and GAO audits. Academic research on correctional officer stress. National journalism on ADX staffing challenges. Verifiable reports about staffing shortages, violence risk, and mental health strain. No private individuals are named. Composite officer characters appear only to represent patterns documented across these sources. Let's step into the other side of the Supermax. The weight no one sees. ADX Florence is built on control. Electronic doors. Cameras covering every angle. Remote-operated gates. Tunnels of concrete and steel where no object is placed without purpose. But control requires people. Corrections officers, COs, are the living pieces of the Supermax machine. Without them, ADX is just a fortress with no guards. And their job is nothing like the public imagines. Hollywood shows them as brute enforcers. News clips portray them as stoic silhouettes. Public commentary reduces them to stereotypes. But the truth, according to union representatives, public surveys, investigative reporting, and officers who have spoken on record, is far more complex. Correctional officers at ADX face chronic understaffing. Undergo psychological strain from the environment. Carry the memory of officer murders at other federal prisons. Work surrounded by inmates with documented histories of violence. Experience shifts in sensory perception due to extreme quiet. Risk injury even in a facility designed to prevent it. Absorb emotional stress without public recognition. Struggle with burnout, PTSD-like symptoms, and sleep disorders. Often feel unseen, misunderstood, and undervalued. In this place, the silence does not only surround the inmates. It surrounds the officers too. A composite officer, Davis, pseudonym. A fictional composite synthesized from dozens of verified officer accounts. Davis is not one man. He is hundreds, the experiences of COs collected from verified interviews, congressional testimony, and public reporting. Davis walks into ADX every morning with the same routine. Keys clipped. Badge tight. Mental guard up. The moment he steps past the first checkpoint, he feels the weight in his chest, not fear exactly, but anticipation. Awareness. Inside ADX, nothing is casual. Every sound matters. Every movement matters. Every silence matters. Davis learned early in his career that inmate behavior inside a Supermax is unpredictable in a slow, simmering way. Not like riots, those don't happen here. But in explosions of tension that erupt without warning. A whisper of metal against concrete. A glance from a narrow slit of glass. A sharpened object discovered too late in a routine search. He has seen all of it. And he remembers every moment. The murders that never happened here, but live here. ADX was built after violent assaults and homicides inside other federal prisons shocked the system into action. Correctional officers at ADX carry that history with them. Some officers interviewed in national news stories said, "We know what can happen because we saw what happened at Marion." Every officer in the system remembers those attacks. It's part of our memory. Even though ADX has had far fewer fatal incidents than other federal prisons, the fear is inherited, a generational trauma passed down through institutional memory. They know. Inmates here include men who killed correctional officers elsewhere. Some inmates used violence as a strategy. Some inmates are experts in manipulation. Some inmates behave unpredictably due to severe mental illness. And when Davis walks past a cell, that history walks with him. The silence that breaks you. Psychologists studying CO stress have identified unique environmental impacts in Supermax prisons. Most officers work in noisy dormitories, open cell blocks, chaotic intake units. ADX officers work in quiet. Almost total quiet. Davis describes it in a composite reflection based on public accounts. The silence. It's unnatural. After a while, you start hearing things that aren't there. Like your brain is trying to fill in the space. This isn't hallucination. It's sensory adaptation. Human beings are not built for persistent, controlled quiet. Davis continues. When I go home, it feels loud. Even when my house is quiet. This phenomenon, documented in correctional research, is known as sensory rebound, heightened reactivity to normal stimuli after prolonged exposure to monotony. It's not dangerous. But it's exhausting. ADX officers live it every week. The job that is 99% monotony and 1% extreme danger. Life inside ADX for officers is a paradox. Most of the time, nothing happens. But when something does happen, it's sudden, violent, and potentially life-changing. Officers describe a steady baseline of tension. Monitoring inmates through reinforced glass. Checking food slots. Conducting pat-down searches during limited movement. Escorting inmates through remote-controlled gates. Responding to self-harm signals. Managing inmates with severe mental illness. For 99% of the shift. Routine. Monotony. Repetition. Then. A flash of danger. An inmate throwing boiling liquid during a tray delivery. A makeshift weapon sliding through the food slot. A sudden physical outburst during an escort. A suicide attempt requiring immediate intervention. An inmate slamming his head into the wall until blood covers the floor. A cell extraction turning chaotic. These incidents are all documented in court records, audits, and public investigations, not as everyday events, but as real risks in the Supermax environment. For Davis, it means he never relaxes. Never fully exhales. Even when the hallway is quiet. Especially when the hallway is quiet. The emotional walls officers build. Correctional officers often describe developing emotional detachment as a survival mechanism. They cannot empathize too deeply with inmate suffering. Internalize inmate manipulation. Show vulnerability. Maintain friendships with inmates. Relax within sight or sound of cell blocks. Davis explains this in a composite monologue. You can't let what you see get to you. If a guy is screaming for hours, you can't absorb that. If a guy is hurting himself, you follow protocol. If a guy says he's going to kill you, you keep walking. He pauses. But when you go home, you hear it again. Officers often struggle to talk about their experiences. Research shows high rates of anxiety, depression, nightmares, emotional numbing, difficulty expressing affection, trouble transitioning between work and home. The walls of ADX create emotional walls inside the people who guard it. The moral pressure, am I part of the problem? ADX is controversial worldwide. Human rights groups criticize prolonged isolation. Foreign courts hesitate to extradite people who might end up there. Psychologists question long-term sensory deprivation. Officers feel that moral tension. They hear it in the news. They read it in lawsuits. They see it in public statements. Davis articulates this collective feeling. People say what we do is torture. They say the place is torture. But we're not the ones who created the crimes. We're not the ones who built the prison. We just work here. We do the job the country asks us to do. This conflict, between duty and morality, is one of the deepest psychological burdens in correctional work. Officers at ADX enforce a system they did not design. But they feel its weight every day. The staffing problem that makes everything worse. For years, the Bureau of Prisons has faced nationwide staffing shortages, a fact confirmed in DOJ audits, union statements, and national reporting. At ADX, where inmates are high risk and procedures require multiple officers for everything, staffing shortages create mandatory overtime, burnout, reduced reaction time, increased stress, safety concerns, training issues, officer fatigue. Davis describes it through composite testimony. I've worked 16-hour shifts back to back. You go home, sleep 4 hours, and come back. Your mind isn't right. But the job doesn't stop. Officers misjudge risk when exhausted. They misread subtle cues. They become more vulnerable. Fatigue becomes danger. And danger becomes policy failure. The trauma no one talks about. Supermax officers have one of the highest trauma exposure rates of any profession in the United States. Documented psychological risks include PTSD, hypervigilance, emotional detachment, insomnia, substance dependence, suicidal ideation. One federally published research survey found that correctional officers experience PTSD symptoms at rates comparable to military veterans. Davis explains it simply. We see things most people don't think happen in real life. Self-harm. Violent outbursts. Psychotic breaks. Men deteriorating mentally in front of them. Even when officers follow every procedure, the memory remains. The human moments that break through. Despite the rules. Despite the walls. Despite the emotional armor. Officers and inmates sometimes share moments that feel almost human. A calm conversation. A joke. A shared acknowledgement of weather or time. Even small interactions can be grounding. One officer publicly described a moment when an inmate simply said, "Thank you." It shook him. Davis has had moments like that too, composite moments drawn from dozens of verified accounts. A quiet "good morning." A respectful nod. A note written during a mental health check expressing gratitude. These moments remind officers. They are guarding people, not just inmates. But that reminder is also emotionally dangerous. It disrupts the protective detachment. It reintroduces empathy into a place where empathy can become vulnerability. And yet, these tiny connections sometimes keep officers going. The price of guarding a supermax. For officers at ADX Florence, the job takes a toll in ways the public rarely sees. Divorce rates higher than national averages. Difficulty forming friendships outside law enforcement. Increased aggression or irritability. Hyper-awareness in public spaces. Estrangement from family. Emotional numbness. Identity tied entirely to the job. Shortened life expectancy, a trend across correctional fields. But why do they stay? Why do people like Davis keep walking into the fortress every day? The answer they give, and the answer beneath it. When interviewed publicly, officers often say, "I do it because someone has to." Or, "I take pride in protecting society." These statements are true. But beneath them lies something else. A sense of duty. A sense of control in a chaotic world. A belief that the work matters, even when no one sees it. A bond with other officers forged in stress few civilians will ever understand. And for some, the silence becomes familiar. Not comfortable, but known. Humans can adapt to almost anything. Even a world built on concrete and control. The invisible victims of ADX. Correctional officers rarely appear in documentaries. Rarely receive credit for what they endure. Rarely have their trauma acknowledged. But they are part of the story. Part of the legacy. Part of the price. ADX Florence changed the officers who work there just as deeply as it changed the inmates who live there. And that is the truth at the core of this chapter. No one walks through ADX Florence unchanged. Not the guilty. Not the innocent. Not the officers who guard the silence every day. The final image, Davis at the gate. Our composite officer ends his shift. He walks out of the control corridor, through the concrete vestibules, through the metal detectors, past the perimeter fence humming with electricity. He steps into the cold Colorado wind. The mountains rise in the distance, blue and jagged. The sky feels too open. The world too loud. He drives home quietly, thinking about the day. The silence. The steel. The eyes behind the doors. The weight of responsibility. The effort to stay human in a place built to suppress humanity. Tomorrow, he will walk back into the fortress. Because someone has to. But tonight, he breathes. For the first time all day, he breathes. And the silence stays behind him. Mostly. The architecture of control, building the unescapable prison. Before a single inmate ever arrived. Before the concrete cured. Before the razor wire glistened under the Colorado sun. ADX Florence existed as an idea. A radical idea. A prison designed not simply to hold men, but to eliminate the very possibility of escape, violence, manipulation, or influence. A place engineered so completely that every surface, every angle, every echo served a purpose. Tonight, we step into the blueprint of the Supermax. The real blueprint. Assembled from publicly available architectural records, Bureau of Prisons descriptions, construction contracts, federal planning documents, court filings, and investigative journalism. No speculation. No fictionalized construction details. Only what is known, publicly verified, and ethically presented. Let's explore the physical body of ADX Florence, and the philosophy embedded in its bones. The birth of a blueprint. ADX Florence opened in 1994, but its roots go deeper. In the 1980s and early 1990s, violence erupted in federal penitentiaries nationwide. Prison gangs gained power. High-profile inmates orchestrated crimes from behind bars. Correctional officers were murdered in facilities once considered secure. The U.S. needed something beyond a maximum security prison. It needed a fortress. Construction planning, according to federal procurement documents, began with a simple question. What would a prison look like if it had to stop the most dangerous inmates in the nation, not some of the time, but all of the time? Architects, security specialists, psychologists, and corrections veterans answered. What emerged was not a building. It was a system. A machine of control disguised as a prison. The location, isolation before concrete. ADX Florence sits in Fremont County, Colorado, an area often called Prison Valley due to the cluster of correctional facilities surrounding it. The site selection itself was strategic. 1. Geographic isolation. Miles from major cities, surrounded by plain and mountain. Escapees would face harsh terrain, winter storms, and exposure. 2. Controlled perimeter. Open land provides clean sight lines for surveillance. No urban clutter. No hiding places. 3. Existing federal infrastructure. The region already housed federal prisons, making staffing and logistics easier. 4. Low population density. Minimized risk to civilians in the event of an emergency. Before a single wall stood, the land itself acted as a barrier. But the walls would take that to another level. The perimeter, a gauntlet of steel and signals. Public descriptions of ADX's security outline multiple layers of perimeter defense. The outer fence. A tall barrier topped with razor wire, monitored by cameras and motion detectors. The inner fence. Even more heavily reinforced, double-wrapped with razor coils, vibration sensors, and intrusion alarms. The perimeter road. Armed patrol vehicles circulate constantly, scanning for movement. The watchtowers. Unlike older penitentiaries, ADX's towers rely less on human eyes and more on technology. Infrared cameras. Pan-tilt zoom surveillance. Thermal imaging. Watchtowers are rarely manned physically. A symbolic shift from human oversight to automated control. This perimeter is not about catching escapees. It's about making escape impossible. The walls, thicker than a bunker. ADX's walls are not normal prison walls. Multiple public sources describe them as reinforced concrete, steel mesh embedded inside, resistant to cutting tools, resistant to explosive force, resistant to tunneling, resistant to climbing. The cells extend deep into the structure. No cell borders an exterior wall. No inmate can access a point where structural integrity is vulnerable. Even if someone possessed the strength, tools, and time to destroy a section of the interior, it wouldn't matter. Behind it lies another wall. And another. And another. ADX is not a building that contains cells. ADX is a cell that contains a building. The corridors, a labyrinth of control. Inside ADX, it becomes clear that movement is not a right. It is a privilege, a rare event, and a carefully monitored process. 1. Zoned corridors. The prison is divided into zones separated by electronically controlled steel gates. 2. Airlock-style doors. Only one door in a sequence can open at a time. Staff pass through like astronauts entering a vacuum chamber. Each checkpoint sealed behind them before the next opens. 3. Camera dominance. Cameras watch every angle. Blind spots do not exist. Every corridor, every intersection, every nook is visible. 4. Controlled staff movement. Even officers cannot move freely. They rely on control room operators to open doors. This eliminates hostage scenarios and ambush risk. ADX is not designed to trust people. Even staff. It trusts systems. The control room, the heart of the machine. Imagine a room filled with screens. Rows of monitors displaying every hallway, every recreation pen, every airlock, every cell door. This is the control center. The brain of the Supermax. From here, operators can open or lock any door. Activate alarms. Monitor cameras. Control electronic restraints. Track movement of officers and inmates. Dispatch emergency responses. Record unusual behavior. At ADX, officers seldom touch cell doors. Doors open remotely. So no one needs to stand within reach of an inmate. It is the physical manifestation of the Supermax philosophy. Distance is safety. Visibility is control. Technology is authority. The cells, designed for total neutralization. Public descriptions of ADX interior design paint a stark picture. Cells measure roughly 7 by 12 feet. Concrete bed. Concrete desk. Concrete stool. Stainless steel sink toilet unit. Everything is anchored. Nothing can be picked up, swung, sharpened, or used as leverage. The window. Infamous in documentaries. Is a narrow vertical slit angled toward the sky. Inmates cannot see. Other inmates. The yard. The mountains. Staff movement. Escape landmarks. Just a fragment of sky. Even the shower is inside the cell, automated on schedule, eliminating reasons for escorts. Lighting is controlled externally. Inmates cannot darken the room entirely. This prevents concealment or self-harm attempts that depend on shadows. The entire cell is a behavioral algorithm. No visibility. No mobility. No opportunity. No leverage. No privacy. No weaponizable object. It is not cruelty. It is engineered prevention. The recreation cages, freedom without freedom. Public records describe ADX recreation rooms as concrete enclosures. Partially open to the sky, but not to the horizon. Completely isolated from other inmates. Surrounded by thick mesh or reinforced fencing. In older interviews, some inmates called them dog runs. Advocates call them concrete pens. Officials call them recreation spaces. But the purpose is clear. Let inmates experience fresh air. Without experiencing one another. Isolation is architectural. Programmatic. Intentional. The special security units, silence as infrastructure. Certain ADX units, such as the control unit and the special security unit, represent the most extreme form of containment. Public filings describe features like advanced soundproofing, indirect supervision, restricted communication, limited access to reading materials, controlled lighting, constant monitoring. The design removes the sensory cues inmates use to time their routines, communicate between cells, track staff rotations, observe vulnerabilities. Even the air vents are engineered to prevent sound transmission. ADX doesn't just isolate bodies. It isolates senses. The staff safety systems, engineered to prevent risk. Correctional officers at ADX face unique danger, despite the environment. To mitigate this, designers incorporated layers of protection. 1. No direct contact. Inmates rarely come within arm's reach of staff. 2. Food slots with safety shields. Prevents grabbing or throwing objects. 3. Secure escort procedures. When movement occurs, it involves multiple officers, shackles, additional restraints, controlled hallways. 4. Cell extraction protocols. Teams are protected by shields, armor, and tactics designed to minimize injury. 5. Alarm sensors. Cell doors can trigger alerts if tampered with. 6. Suicide-resistant architecture. Fixtures are designed to minimize anchoring points. All of this was built because real officers were killed in older prisons. Architecture became the correctional officer's body armor. The psychology of design. ADX Florence isn't just a fortress. It is a psychological environment. Researchers have described several design principles. 1. Sensory reduction. Less noise. Less sight. Less contact. This reduces stimulation that fuels conflict, but increases psychological strain. 2. Spatial compression. Small spaces prevent pacing attacks or strategic movement. 3. Monotony. Predictability reduces confrontation. 4. Isolation. Decreases gang communication and violent coordination. 5. Indirect staff interaction. Prevents manipulation and bribery. This is architecture as behavior modification. Not through force, but through absence. ADX Florence is a place where nothingness becomes the environment. A composite inmate perspective, the men who measured the world in inches. A composite summary of publicly documented inmate reactions to ADX settings. One inmate, composite, built from multiple verified accounts, kept track of the exact dimensions of his space. 7 feet wide. 12 feet long. Window slit. 4 inches by 36 inches. Rec pen, less than 200 square feet. He traced the edges with his fingers until the concrete felt smooth. He memorized every crack. He said in a publicly inspired dramatized statement, "I live in a world measured in inches." For him, architecture wasn't structure. It was destiny. A destiny written in concrete and angles. Why has no one ever escaped ADX? Public statements from the Bureau of Prisons emphasize one fact. No inmate has ever escaped from ADX Florence. Here's why. 1. No access to tools. Nothing in the environment can be dismantled or sharpened. 2. No access to people. No hostages. No accomplices. No inside contacts. 3. No access to exterior walls. Cells are buried deep inside layers of structure. 4. Remote-controlled doors. Inmates cannot manipulate locks. 5. Redundant systems. Even if one layer fails, others compensate. 6. Geographic isolation. Even an escaped inmate, virtually impossible, would face open desert and rapid response. 7. Predictive design. Designers studied every known escape attempt in U.S. prison history and engineered the building to block those methods. Escape isn't difficult at ADX. It's irrelevant. The facility removes the concept itself. The dark side of control, architecture as burden. In Chapter 3, we explored the psychological effects on inmates. But here's the twist. The architecture affects officers too. Correctional staff report. Sensory strain. Hypervigilance. Stress from the monotony. Discomfort from silence. Difficulty adjusting to normal acoustic environments. Physical fatigue from escort procedures. Emotional distance due to compartmentalized movement. The building shapes its keepers. And the building does not care. The future of Supermax design. What comes next? Public policy debates suggest several trends. 1. More technology, less manpower. AI-enhanced surveillance. Automated checks. 2. Reducing extreme isolation. Several states and federal courts are re-evaluating prolonged solitary. 3. Specialized mental health units. New designs, softer environments, targeted treatment. 4. Modular prisons. Units built with flexibility for changing legal standards. 5. Enhanced transparency. Architectural features that allow oversight without compromising security. ADX Florence may remain the pinnacle of containment. But the world is shifting. And architecture must shift with it. The final image, a prison that reflects U.S. In the end, ADX Florence's architecture reveals as much about America as about the inmates inside it. It reflects our fear of violence, our need for control, our belief in concrete solutions, our trust in systems, our discomfort with ambiguity, our struggle to balance safety and humanity. ADX is not just a building. It is a blueprint of national values. Rigid, complex, protective, unforgiving, ingenious, controversial, inescapable. A fortress built not merely to hold men, but to contain the shadows they cast. And in doing so, it holds up a mirror to the country that built it. A mirror made of concrete. A mirror with a view of the sky through a slit. The world beyond the box, life after ADX. For most people, the story of ADX Florence ends at the concrete door. A man is locked inside the most secure prison in America. A cell becomes his world. Silence becomes his language. Isolation becomes his constant companion. But the myth of ADX leaves out one truth. Some men leave. Not all. Not many. But some. They walk out of the concrete vault, out of the slit-windowed cell, out of the sensory compression chamber that has reshaped their minds for years, sometimes decades. They do not walk into freedom. They walk into another prison. Another world. A world filled with noise, movement, people, stimulus, emotion, conflict, hierarchy, contact. A world they are no longer prepared for. Tonight, we follow the journey that rarely makes the documentaries, rarely appears in news headlines, and rarely gets told at all. What happens to men who survive ADX, and then must survive life after ADX? This chapter is drawn entirely from publicly documented inmate interviews, Bureau of Prisons step-down and transfer policies, real federal sentencing hearings and appeals, Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, investigation findings, academic studies on solitary confinement effects, journalistic reporting on post-Supermax transfers, verified psychological research, composite accounts representing repeated, documented behavioral patterns. Let's enter the world that comes after America's toughest prison. The moment of release, a door opens, and a new fear begins. When an inmate finishes the step-down program, ADX Florence initiates a transfer to another facility. Usually a United States penitentiary, USP. Sometimes a medium facility for those with good conduct. Occasionally a communications management unit, CMU, for specific security needs. But before any movement occurs, there is a moment that every inmate remembers. A moment described in multiple publicly available letters and interviews. A moment of shock. Of disorientation. Of disbelief. A door opens. A hallway appears. And for the first time in years, the inmate sees movement, asterisk asterisk. Not controlled movement. Not distant figures behind concrete layers. But real, human, unpredictable movement. Officers walking toward him. The flicker of fluorescent light on polished floor. The subtle sway of a vent. The sound of real footsteps. For some, it is exhilarating. For others, it is terrifying. A composite inmate perspective, drawn from numerous real accounts, puts it this way. Leaving ADX felt like stepping off a cliff into a world I didn't recognize. Everything moved too fast. Everything was too close. What should feel like freedom feels instead like vertigo. And that is just the beginning. The first transfer, riding in shackles through a world that has changed. Transfers from ADX follow strict public Bureau of Prisons procedure. Full restraints. Heavy escort. Specialized transportation. Secure routes. Minimal stops. Extensive monitoring. But what stands out most to former ADX prisoners is not the transport. It is the world outside. Many haven't seen trees in years. Or cars. Or children. Or open skies. Their last memories of the outside world may date back to the day of sentencing. The day of arrest. The last prison yard before ADX. Or decades earlier. Composite accounts based on verified patterns describe this moment with emotional precision. I saw a highway and didn't know how to look at it. It felt fake. I kept waiting for the sky to disappear again. Everything outside the window felt too bright, like someone turned up the saturation on reality. These are not metaphors. Neurological research confirms that people leaving long-term solitary confinement often experience sensory overload, disorientation, difficulty processing movement, anxiety triggered by visual complexity, panic reactions to unpredictable noise. The outside world is not comforting. It is overwhelming. The arrival, a new prison that feels like chaos. A U.S. penitentiary is itself a high-security facility. But compared to ADX, it feels lawless. Not because the staff are negligent. Not because inmates are unruly. But because the prison environment is alive in ways ADX never is. In USPs, inmates congregate, speak, shout, trade, exercise, eat together, move with limited freedom. For a men conditioned to silence, social absence, observation without interaction, and sensory deprivation, this environment feels like an explosion. One former federal inmate interviewed by journalists described it this way. ADX quiets you. The next prison wakes you up by hitting you with a bucket of cold water. Public accounts described common reactions. 1. Panic during open movement. Some transferred inmates freeze when other prisoners walk past them. 2. Startle responses. Sudden noises cause flinching, crouching, or defensive postures. 3. Limited speech ability. Many ADX transfers struggle to speak clearly after years of silence. 4. Social confusion. Group behavior is hard to interpret. Tone, intent, volume, all feel foreign. 5. Hypervigilance. Paranoia spikes, even when no threat is present. 6. Emotional numbness or inappropriate reactions. Laughing at the wrong times. Crying at unexpected moments. Withdrawing completely. A correctional officer at a high-security USP once told a reporter, "When an ADX guy arrives, you can tell instantly. He moves differently. He reacts differently. He's wired tight." The social shock, human contact as a threat. Imagine that you have spent years without being touched. Without brushing shoulders. Without hearing laughter. Without speaking face to face. Without seeing a crowd. Now imagine walking into a unit with 100 inmates moving freely within a day room. Every sound amplified. Every motion unpredictable. Every social cue unfamiliar. Psychologists call this the social reentry crisis. Inmates call it something else. Hell with people. A composite inmate account based on documented patterns describes the first day in a standard USP. Guys kept coming up to me. Asking questions. I didn't know what they wanted. I thought every one of them was trying to set me up. The paranoia is not irrational. In many USPs. Prison politics. Gang affiliations. Reputation. Toughness. Alliances. Matter deeply. An inmate who appears weak, disoriented, or traumatized may become a target. Staff know this. They monitor ADX transfers closely. But even with vigilance, the environment itself is chaotic compared to the Supermax. And the human mind doesn't reset simply because the cell changes. The communication challenge, speech returns slowly. Multiple public reports and lawsuits have documented speech deterioration in long-term solitary confinement. Inmates may stutter, speak softly, forget conversational rhythm, find verbal interaction exhausting, lose confidence in speaking, avoid talking unless forced. Some transferred inmates struggle to use their voices at normal volume. Others pause for long seconds before responding. The result? Social misunderstandings. Conflict. Perceived disrespect. In prison, misunderstanding can be dangerous. A former inmate summarized it. If you don't answer fast enough, people think you're disrespecting them. If you answer too fast, people think you're hiding something. ADX conditions do not prepare a man for these subtleties. It takes months, sometimes years, to regain fluid speech patterns. And some never fully recover. The loneliness nobody expects. Surrounded but separate. A paradox emerges. After craving human contact for years, many ADX transfers cannot tolerate it. They keep to themselves. They avoid day rooms. They skip recreation. They isolate voluntarily. Staff have documented inmates who ask to return to their cells, avoid chow halls, refuse group programs, stop attending recreation, request single-cell status if possible, withdraw from conversation entirely. The isolation becomes a habit, a defense, a comfort zone, a familiar pain they know how to navigate. A composite inmate voice describes it. I wanted to talk to people for years. When I finally could, I didn't know how. The threats they face, the prison gang factor. Another danger looms over ADX transfers. Politics. In USPs, prison gangs often shape the social structure. Some inmates are transferred far from their original networks. Some are transferred directly into territories controlled by groups hostile to their background. Some have reputations, real or perceived, that follow them. Even without naming real individuals, public cases show high-profile inmates, former gang members, former informants, individuals convicted of certain categories of crime, inmates with mental illness, or those perceived as vulnerable, may be targeted. ADX conditions do not prepare a man to navigate these waters. The step-down program includes limited socialization. But it is not the same as entering a free-moving prison population. Composite narratives from confirmed patterns show inmates saying, "Guys asked where I was from, who I ran with. I didn't even know how to answer anymore." Missteps here can lead to violence. And some ADX transfers end up back in isolation, this time not as punishment, but for protection. The mental health fallout, a price paid in silence. Experts studying solitary confinement have documented long-term psychological consequences such as intrusive memories, difficulty focusing, emotional numbness, impulsivity, paranoia, depression, sleep disturbances, memory problems, sensory hypersensitivity, panic attacks. Many men transferred out of ADX carry these conditions into their new prison environment. One inmate publicly described his post-ADX insomnia. "I slept better at ADX. Out here, the noise keeps me awake." Another described panic at being around others. "Standing in line made my heart race like I was under attack." These reactions are not weaknesses. They are symptoms of neurological adaptation to extreme isolation. A brain wired for silence cannot adjust instantly to chaos. The officer view, what they see when ADX inmates arrive. Correctional officers in USPs report that ADX transfers stand out immediately. A staff member quoted in public reporting summarized, "They don't know how to be around people anymore." Officers frequently see hypersensitivity to noise, poor eye contact, slow or unusual speech patterns, rigid body posture, social withdrawal, startle responses, confusion during simple interactions. Most officers respond with closer monitoring, protection measures, mental health referrals, counseling support. But even with help, the adjustment period is difficult. A CO described it as putting someone from a sensory deprivation tank straight into Times Square. Not a gentle landing. A collision. The few who adapt, and how they do it. Some men succeed. Public records include examples of inmates who, after leaving ADX, managed to engage in educational programs, work institutional jobs, build routine, socialize safely, avoid disciplinary incidents, earn reductions in custody level. These men share several traits. 1. Strong psychological resilience. Not luck. Adaptation. 2. Clear structure in their daily routine. They build habits to compensate for the unpredictability of the general population. 3. Selective socialization. They interact with trusted individuals but avoid unnecessary conflict. 4. Engagement with mental health services, therapy, medication, coping strategies. 5. Patience. Readjustment may take years. One former inmate, quoted in a national newspaper, said, "The world felt too big at first. But piece by piece, I learned how to live in it again." This is not redemption. It is survival. The ones who struggle, when ADX leaves a permanent mark. Some men cannot adapt. Not because they don't try. Not because they are unwilling. But because isolation has reshaped them in ways they cannot undo. Public cases reveal inmates who returned to disciplinary units, requested isolation, engaged in self-harm, suffered mental health crises, deteriorated psychologically, struggled with basic group functioning. For these men, ADX was not a chapter. It was a transformation. A prison architect once described Supermax confinement as A place that changes the brain. When the brain changes, the world does too. For some, that world becomes unmanageable. The role of family, connection and rebuilding. Some inmates have family waiting. Parents. Siblings. Children. Partners. Rebuilding relationships after ADX is complex. Phone calls feel foreign. Visits feel overwhelming. Conversations feel forced. A composite family account based on verified interviews puts it like this. He was alive, but he wasn't the same person. Some inmates rebuild bonds over time. Others drift emotionally. And some simply do not have families waiting anymore. Time has passed, people have moved on, or the crimes themselves severed ties. For these individuals, reintegration into general prison life becomes the only community they have left. The irony of freedom, what they miss about ADX. This may be the most shocking truth in the chapter. Some men transferred out of ADX miss it. Not because they enjoyed it. Not because it was humane. Not because it was comfortable. But because the silence felt safe. The rules were predictable. Danger was controlled. Isolation shielded them from conflict. They could not be harmed by others. They did not have to navigate complex social dynamics. A composite inmate perspective explains. ADX was hard. But it was simple. Out here, prison politics will kill you faster than loneliness. This is not a praise of the Supermax. It is proof of how deeply it changes a person. ADX is a world where nothing happens. Other prisons are worlds where everything happens at once. And for men conditioned to the first world, the second can feel unbearable. The end of the line, end of sentence after ADX. A small number of individuals eventually complete their federal sentences after spending years in ADX or being transferred from it. Their re-entry into society is documented in re-entry research, public interviews, sentencing memos, post-release supervision reports. Challenges include PTSD symptoms, panic in crowds, difficulty maintaining employment, distrust of others, sensory overwhelm, trouble forming relationships, hypervigilance, emotional detachment. One former inmate interviewed anonymously said, "I felt like I was still in a cell even when I was walking down the street. Freedom did not feel free. It felt unfamiliar." The truth about life after ADX. So what is the truth about inmates who leave ADX Florence? It is this. Leaving ADX is not the end of the sentence. It is the beginning of a new kind of struggle. A struggle to relearn. Noise. Movement. Communication. Emotion. Trust. Social survival. Identity. A struggle to live in a world they no longer recognize. A struggle that the justice system rarely prepares them for. Some succeed. Some fail. Some adapt slowly. Some never adapt at all. But every one of them carries ADX with them. In their speech, their movement, their reactions, their fears, their routines. ADX is not just a place. It is an imprint. A psychological tattoo. A shadow that follows them long after the concrete disappears. The final image. A man sitting in a normal prison yard, looking at the sky. A composite figure, drawn from many real accounts. He sits on a bench in the yard of a standard high-security penitentiary. Around him, inmates laugh. Officers talk. Basketballs bounce. Radios play static. Voices travel. The world moves. He looks up. The sky is wide. Not a slit. Not an angled rectangle. Not a controlled fragment. A full sky. And instead of feeling free, he feels small. Lost. Unmoored. For years, he saw only a slice of this sky, framed by concrete, narrowed by architecture, controlled by design. Now, the world is too large. ADX did not break him. But it reshaped him. And like everyone who leaves the Supermax, officers and inmates alike, He must carry that reshaping into every day that follows. Prison Valley, life in the shadow of ADX Florence. There are places in America where a prison defines a town. Where razor wire and watchtowers are as familiar as street signs. Where the rhythm of life is set not by traffic, tourism, or commerce, but by the slow breathing of a correctional system that never sleeps. Florence, Colorado, is one of those places. A small town tucked against the sharp beauty of the Rocky Mountain foothills. A town that once thrived on ranching, mining, railroads, and milling. A town of antique shops, Victorian homes, cafes, and quiet streets. But behind that postcard image lies another identity. Florence is home to the highest concentration of federal prisons in the United States. 7 facilities. Thousands of inmates. Thousands of staff. Billions of dollars in federal investment. And at the center of it all, ADX Florence, the most secure federal prison ever built. Also known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies. The fortress in the foothills. The end of the line. To understand ADX, we must understand the world around it. Because prisons do not exist in isolation. They shape the towns they inhabit. They alter economies, politics, identity, and the lives of the people who live just beyond the concrete walls. This is the story of a community built beside the Supermax. A community changed by it. A community that lives with its shadow every day. The land before the prisons. Long before the federal government arrived, Florence had a different soul. Public historical records describe a thriving late 19th century oil boom. Coal mining operations. The Denver and Rio Grande Railway pulsing through the region. Brickmaking and milling. Orchards and ranchlands. A small but prosperous main street. In the early 20th century, Florence became known for its flour mills, its fruit processing, its textile and bottling plants, its community churches and civic clubs. A town that grew slowly but steadily. A town that felt familiar, close-knit, defiantly local. But industries decline. Jobs move. Booms collapse. Oil fields dry up. By the mid-20th century, Florence faced the same fate as many rural American towns. Economic stagnation, population decline, and the slow erosion of opportunity. It needed something new. Something big. Something that could anchor the economy for decades. What arrived was not a factory, nor a tech boom, nor a tourism surge. What arrived was the federal government. And with it, the prison complex now known as the Federal Correctional Complex, FCC, Florence. The coming of the Supermax, a federal transformation. Public planning documents show that federal officials selected Florence for strategic reasons. Available land. Existing rail and highway access. Proximity to Colorado Springs and Pueblo. Low population density. Political support. Previous industrial infrastructure. The first facilities opened in the early 1990s. FCI Florence. USP Florence. A detention center. Administrative units. Then, in 1994, the crown jewel arrived. ADX Florence, the highest security level in the Bureau of Prisons. Overnight, Florence transformed from a quiet rural town into a national focal point of the American criminal justice system. Local leaders welcomed it. Not because they wanted a Supermax, but because they needed jobs. Correctional officer jobs. Administrative jobs. Maintenance jobs. Medical, food service, logistics, construction jobs. Federal employment meant stability. Benefits. Retirement. Generational careers. And for a town facing economic uncertainty, that mattered deeply. Prison Valley, a town with more inmates than residents. By the late 1990s, journalists began calling the region Prison Valley. Not as an insult. As a description. Between Florence and nearby Cannon City, the region hosts the ADX Supermax. A federal penitentiary, USP. A federal medium security facility. A federal minimum security camp. Numerous Colorado state prisons. Private correctional centers, historically. Combined, this corridor has housed over 7,000 inmates at various points. The population of Florence? Roughly 3,500 to 4,000 residents. In other words, there are more inmates in the area than civilians. This ratio shapes everything. Culture. Politics. Economy. Local identity. Day-to-day life. If you live in Florence, you likely know someone who works inside a prison. It might be your neighbor, your parent, your spouse, your friend. Prison work is woven into the town's fabric. But the presence of ADX, with its notorious inmates and extreme conditions, adds another layer. A layer of fascination. A layer of fear. A layer of pride. A layer of mystery. The economy of concrete, how ADX created jobs. The Bureau of Prisons is one of the largest federal employers in the region. ADX alone brought hundreds of correctional officer positions, medical staff, mental health professionals, administrative workers, facility maintenance teams, food service employees, electricians, HVAC specialists, perimeter security maintenance, transportation officers. With federal employment came stable salaries, health insurance, pensions, paid leave, job security rare in rural America. Local businesses benefited. Diners filled with COs on lunch break. Real estate stabilized. Construction surged. Hardware stores supported maintenance needs. Local government revenue increased. Town leaders publicly praised the economic boost. One former mayor, quoted in news articles, called the prison complex the engine that kept Florence alive. And in many ways, he was right. Without the prisons, Florence might have remained a struggling ex-industrial town. Instead, it became a community built on federal payroll. But with that stability came complexity. The shadow of danger, fear, rumors, and reality. The presence of ADX brings psychological weight. Residents know. Some of the most dangerous federal inmates in U.S. history are housed just outside town. The facility includes high-profile terrorists, gang leaders, organized crime figures, and individuals with extreme escape risk. Even though no one has ever escaped from ADX, the knowledge alone creates unease. Rumors circulate. Stories spread. Local children grow up hearing the names of infamous inmates like urban legends whispered in the schoolyard. A composite resident perspective, drawn from numerous interviews, puts it simply. We don't worry about escape. We worry about what the prison says about our town. Because Florence is known not for its beauty, but for its fortress. Its identity is tied to concrete and razor wire. Whether it wants that identity or not. The culture of corrections, when half the town works in prisons. In a place where prisons dominate employment, a unique culture forms. This culture has several documented traits. 1. A brotherhood and sisterhood of officers. Federal correctional officers often socialize together. Their families know one another. They share a bond strengthened by stress and secrecy. 2. Community sensitivity to crime reporting. Locals may react defensively to external criticism of ADX or FCC Florence. They see criticism of the prison as criticism of their livelihoods. 3. Emotional spillover. Families feel the strain when COs carry trauma, fatigue, or hypervigilance home. One officer's spouse told a reporter. When he comes home, you can tell if he had a rough day. He won't talk about it, but you can feel it. 4. Identity defined by the institution. Many children grow up assuming they will one day work for the Bureau of Prisons. 5. Blurred lines between town and facility. Social circles overlap. The prison influences schedules, local events, and even town politics. The result is a community where prison culture becomes local culture. Not intentionally. Not proudly. Just inevitably. The politics of Prison Valley. Florence's political climate, based on public voting data and local reporting, tends to support law enforcement. Military. Corrections funding. National security measures. This is not surprising. When the majority of middle-class jobs in a region come from a single industry, residents often support policies that sustain it. The presence of ADX also influences federal elections. Candidates who support strong corrections initiatives often resonate locally. State legislation. Any bill that impacts prisons becomes highly relevant. Local budgeting. Town leaders coordinate with federal liaisons regularly. The prison is not just a job provider. It's an anchor of local politics. The media factor, how documentaries affect the town. Every time ADX appears in national media. Documentaries. Movies. True crime podcasts. Investigative journalism. Florence feels the ripple.